Good morning, and welcome to Bradford Health Services' first education event of 2025. I'm Zach Ludwig. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Services and Accreditation for Bradford, welcoming you today for what is going to be a very exciting, engaging presentation by Adam Owens and Kevin Bridgmon about emerging adult populations. I will be introducing today's topic, and I'll also be closing our session today. I want to thank you for joining us. Bradford hosts webinars on a routine basis, generally quarterly, really since 2020, if you've been playing along at home with us the entire time. We are planning to offer 3 additional webinars this year. Make sure that you're checking our website, our LinkedIn postings, and other social media for news about upcoming events. We'll also be posting a link for our events page in the chat and in the Q&A boxes as we go along today. A little preview about what we're planning in June is we're likely to do an ethics training. So if you're in need of those ethics continuing education hours, please make sure you join us then. You're viewing this presentation in the webinar format, which means that you can see the presenters, but your video and your audio are off. You must use either the Q&A or the chat function, which so many of you are using the chat function already this morning. Very good. That's how you're going to communicate with our presenters so that they can be timely in your questions and in your inquiries. It also gives you an opportunity to chat amongst yourselves. What I will ask you to do is to be very mindful of the chat so that you give the opportunity for the presenters to see your inquiry. And that's why the Q&A can sometimes be the better place to post your questions so that they don't get buried in all of these good mornings as you're doing. You do not have to check in the chat in order for your attendance to be counted. Your presence as a participant here is being recorded by the Zoom software. After today's session, you will be receiving a post-session email that will include a link to the material that is presented. As a reference for today, you will get a copy of the slides as well as a recording of today's session. Today's session, you are eligible for 3 continuing education contact hours. Bradford Health Services providing contact hours to you at no charge. Your attendance and your participation today are the log of that attendance. After the conclusion of today's presentation, you're going to get an email with that link. We're also going to put it in the chat. We're going to put it in the Q&A. In case you don't get it, you will get it in that email. I know people are always very excited to do the evaluation. I encourage you to do it as soon as you can so that you do not forget, because you must complete the evaluation in order for you to receive your continuing education credit. After you complete the survey, give us about 2 weeks in order for us to email that certificate to you. After about 2 weeks, if you have not received it and you have checked your spam folder, then start reaching out to us through our events page to ask us about the status of your certificate. Many times the reason you do not get a certificate is you did not complete the survey evaluation. We're only going to keep the survey evaluation open to you for 30 days. After 30 days, we will be closing the survey. So if you do not complete it in 30 days, you are not eligible for continuing education. I hate to tell you that, but without fail, we will have multiple people from this presentation that will be disappointed they're not going to get their hours after sitting here with us for 3 hours. If you'd like to complete the survey immediately after the presentation, again, I'm encouraging you to do that. We're going to put it in the chat box. At the end, we're going to put it in the Q&A box. And as I said, we'll email it to you. If we have any technical difficulties, such as a power blip and internet goes down temporarily, we're going to do our very best to log back in as quickly as possible. If that occurs, please stand by with us. Rejoin using the exact same registration link you have. If our interruption is more long-term and we're not able to join back in, you will receive communication via email, the email that you use whenever you registered. And we will provide you details about what we can do for you at that juncture. Okay, we've got the housekeeping out of the way. So I'd like to introduce our session today. We're excited about this session. It's entitled The Broken Brain of the Emerging Adult. And we have two very experienced speakers who are going to be walking us through this topic today. Our presenters are Adam Owens, who's a licensed professional counselor here in Alabama. He works at our outpatient site in the Birmingham, Vestavia area. He'll be joined in a moment with his colleague Kevin Bridgmon. He's a licensed professional counselor with a supervisor designation here in Alabama, and he's our clinical director of our Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile outpatient facilities. I hope you enjoy the presentation. I'm now going to turn it over to the guys. Thank you.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to, again, the Broken Brain of the Emerging Adult. Again, I'm Adam Owens. With me is Kevin Bridgmon. So we are going to basically just kind of give you guys a brief overview of Bradford, and then we'll go into kind of our individual experience, I guess, with this. Something I'm going to reiterate on the front end of this presentation. Number one, everyone will get a copy of the slides. So, as I'm sure most of y'all have been in a presentation where midway through, somebody usually asks that in the chat, or a couple of folks ask that in the chat. At this point, with every CEU event we do, with every PowerPoint we do, that will be submitted to you, so you will have a copy of that. So if anybody midway through asks, because I'm sharing my screen, so I'm not going to be able to see the chat as well. If anybody asks in the middle of the presentation, are the slides going to be available? I'm encouraging y'all to help answer that for people. And then again, just as something else, as a reminder too, that Zach had mentioned, I know a lot of people use the chat function, which is awesome. It's a lot of times we get to connect with people we haven't seen for a while. People we haven't, maybe we only see on the CU event. So it's always nice to say hello. But yes, if you're logged in, we have tally of you being here. If you get kicked out, I know weather's kind of iffy today, mostly for most of us in Alabama. It's going to be probably later tonight, tomorrow. But if weather is bad where you're at for whatever reason, if you get kicked off and you're able to get back on, no big deal. It automatically will track that you're back on the deal. So a lot of these things will just help with keeping the chat down. But all throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions in the chat. Kevin and I both enjoy having that. You can use definitely the questions and answers section, which is nice because it does keep it separate from some of the extra stuff in the chat. But if you need or you have a question during the time period, feel free to put it in the chat. But Kevin, anything?
No, I think you about covered it.
Awesome.
Once again, the slides will be made available.
So again, with the first slide, obviously, we just have a picture of our Bradford inpatient facility that's up in Warrior, Alabama. Again, it's 300 acres. It's a beautiful property. I worked out there for quite a while, for many years actually. But it's a really beautiful program. As you can see, we've got a lot of different places now that we are. That fits under the Bradford umbrella, which is awesome. So we've got different levels of care that we can treat. Obviously, we can do inpatient treatment. We can do long-term extended care programming for, patients that are in safety-sensitive positions, doctors, nurses, lawyers, pilots, things like that, pharmacists. But also, it's a great program for patients that have maybe chronic relapse, but also if they have grief and trauma. So we have a really good grief and trauma program that we do up there. And then again, we've got just different levels of care. So we've got intensive outpatient, which is what patients generally will come to after they leave inpatient treatment, generally anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, for up to 5 days a week, Monday through Thursday. We have a Friday group that we do that's optional. And so it gives them a chance to, again, stay plugged in, but it's, generally 3 hours a day. For them to process that. We've got a PHP program, which started up last year, but now they have their own apartments, which is great. So they can move into their, the apartments. They can process and program throughout the day. Just a lot of different levels of care. So it's not just an inpatient level of care. It's a multitude of different facets. We have the continuing care, that we do after IOP to maintain, connection with patients. So just a lot of really good stuff that we're able to offer. So again, this is the broken brain of the emerging adult. And then again, it's Kevin Bridgmon, who's again, we're in the same office, but we're doing it this way. Just because it fits, I think, better with us being on 2 different screens, and then myself being here as well. Again, Zach mentioned this, but contact hours. So again, we will do the contact hours. Again, you'll get this in the survey. Once you complete the survey, again, like he said, give it 2 weeks. So Pam has enough time to do this, but these are going to be all the things that are going to be available. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin on individual introductions.
All right. So good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Kevin Bridgmon. I am a licensed professional counselor with a supervisory designation here in the state of Alabama. I have been a licensed counselor now for about 15 years. 10 of those have been here at Bradford Health, 9 of which are in the Birmingham office that I'm currently at. I have been the clinical director for our Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile outpatient locations since about 2019. And my entire counseling career has been spent pretty much dealing and assisting with emerging adults, adolescents, emerging adult population. That has kind of been what I have specialized in. So we're very excited to go over this with you all today. And again, as Adam mentioned, any question that you may have, utilize the Q&A, utilize the chat. I've got it up here, kind of monitoring it as we go. We'll try to answer your questions in real time, but if we can't do that or we miss one, of course, at the end, we will save time for that. So if you have a question that you put in the chat and it's not addressed, please just write it down and we'll address it at the end. So, Adam.
All right. Thank you. And again, I'm Adam Owens. I'm an LPC. I'm here also at the Birmingham regional office. Been here at this office for 8 years. Run the one of the morning IOP groups. Total with Bradford, I've been here 16 years. So again, I did about 8 years at inpatient, working as an assistant counselor, teaching the family program, a multitude of jobs at the inpatient facility level of care. I worked at pretty much every cottage that we have out there. Worked with pretty much every population, whether it was the professional tract, whether it was the all women's cottage. But my heart, my passion was always with kind of the emerging adult population, kind of the 18 to 25 range. Partly because that's when I went to treatment at Bradford and Warrior back in 2006. So I was 23 years old, right about to turn 24 when I went to treatment. So I was literally in that emerging adult population, the 18 to 25. So anytime I get a chance to go back and hang out with those guys and maybe help do lectures or, help run a group or something like that, I always enjoy being able to go back out there and really interact with the emerging adult population. Just because, again, Kevin and I both, have worked with the emerging adult population for a really, really long time. And that while both of us can literally work with any population and do well, it's like I think our heart and our passion is always with that emerging adult population. They're a lot of fun to work with. They're a tough group to work with sometimes. They challenge you. They're the harder sometimes to reach because of they don't have as many necessarily things to lose at that point in time at 18, 19, 20 years old versus, let's say, somebody who's 40, more established, a career, a family. So it's really fun for us to be able to work with them and help them to see some things about themselves. But I shifted over from the inpatient to the IOP office, like I said, about 8 or 9 years ago. Worked in the crisis office while I was going back to school full time to become a counselor. And then again, I've been here ever since. I absolutely love what I do. Kevin, same way. I mean, one is that we love what we do. We have a great population that we work with, but also we love our office. I think is one of the best. I don't want to toot our own horns, but we do. We have such a great chemistry with each other, and we love working with each other. And I think the patients see that. And I think that's what helps us to have good success with patients when they're coming into treatment and maybe having some trouble with identifying themselves as being addict, alcoholic, or problematic or whatever. But I think that as time goes on, we're able to really kind of work with them on that. So let me switch over to the next slide. And Kevin's going to just kind of talk about what the objectives are for this presentation today.
Yeah, so the presentation is going to be split into two kind of different areas. One, the broken brain of addiction, kind of going over the disease model, what's happening inside an individual's brain as addiction begins to take hold and as it evolves. A lot of what we deal with in addiction, or what we can see, is outwardly signs, right? That somebody's suffering from addiction, weight loss, bruising from falling, scabs where somebody may be picking at their skin, especially on the face, track marks if somebody's an IV user. All of those things we could see. If somebody's jaundiced from liver failure, those are outwardly signs that somebody's suffering. But what we can't see is what's actually going on in the brain. So we hope to kind of break that down to a very simplistic way so we all can understand it. We're going to go into some scientific things, but we're really going to try and put it in layman's terms so everybody here can understand what is actually going on. So we're going to start off with that. That's probably going to take us an hour, hour and a half, possibly even the first 2 hours, because it is so complex of what we're going to be going over when discussing the brain. Then we'll also kind of throw in what an emerging adult is, kind of what they're going through in terms of life phases, how they may differentiate from an older adult that you may be working with, or even an adolescent. So we're going to kind of define what an emerging adult is, how to better understand that population, why they are such a specific group that has different challenges and different needs. A few years back, we were running some data and realized that the emerging adult male population was our highest rate of AMA, leaving treatment against medical advice across the board. That's both residential, outpatient, IOP. And we kind of started diving deeper into why that was. And a lot of it was because of the opioid, epidemic that we were dealing with. A lot of them were IV heroin, fentanyl users. So very high risk in that regard. A lot of them, most of our IOP groups are co-ed. So a lot of these males were, creating treatment bonds with females. They were getting into relationships, and that's kind of frowned upon in early recovery. So they're getting in these relationships, they're forming these bonds, and what evidently happens is they both end up relapsing, and now they're using together. So they're back on the street, they're leaving treatment, and that's not important. So the hierarchy of needs, treatment is no longer number one. It's not being sick, it's being with this new person that you're so enthralled with, so on and so forth. So then we'll talk about kind of how you approach that population, how you treat them, how you better understand them. As Adam said, they can be difficult to work with, but I find that they are probably the most rewarding population to work for, because they are so genuine. And it may be difficult to get them to open up in the beginning, but once they do, I feel like those are some of the most powerful groups I've ever been involved with, when they really become vulnerable and open up and share what's going on. So we'll kind of get a little bit more into that. So that is our objectives today. Yeah, Claire, they are the funniest. It's never a dull moment when you're running an emerging adult group. I promise you that. So that's kind of our objectives today. First half, which could take us all of 2 hours, we're going to go through the broken brain, what that looks like, and then we'll take a break, probably about 10 minutes. After we get through the brain, we'll come back, we'll open up questions about the brain itself, and then that last half of this presentation, we will go into the emerging adult population.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And again, both Kevin and I, being in the clinical part, like we also want to make sure that we state this, right? That we understand that I know that everybody is extremely busy. So the fact that you even took the time out to log in, like, we really do appreciate it. Obviously, like, you guys can see us, we can't see you. That being said, if you have things that you have to accomplish or you're working on while you're listening to this, that's fine. Like, don't feel guilty for it. Like, we understand. Like, we hope you can watch all of this. We hope that you can, participate and be a part of this thing. But if you have something going on, if you have something with a patient, a client, whatever, if you've got to make a phone call, that's fine. We understand that. So don't feel bad if that happens, because we understand. Especially as the end of the week, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to try to wrap everything in all together. But we do understand that. But
Adam, if I even remotely
yeah.
think you're answering an email during this, we got problems.
Well, don't leave me hanging by myself, right?
I got you.
But as Kevin said, like, yeah, we're going to cover a lot of this stuff. And again, the emerging adult population, like you said, it is definitely like it can be challenging, but it is the most rewarding. Because if you can build that trust with them, if you can build the trust with the emerging adult population, then you have a real chance to plant a seed that hopefully grows right then and there. So I'll give you an example of something that happened recently. In our PHP program, again, it's we're all kind of in the same building, but they're in a separate section of it. But the other day, like, they had patients that were asking about the science of addiction and kind of like what happens and things like that. And what happened was they were like, well, don't you have an old version of the broken brain that you used to do? Now, I will always give credit. Tim Hilton and a lot of y'all that are on this have been a part of, been in a Tim Hilton's, one of his broken brains. And to me, he was the master at it. But I was able to, because I was helping with the family program, like, I got to learn the program itself and got to learn the broken brain lecture. But he passed away a couple of years ago. And so I always want to make sure to give him that credit, right? Because again, even though, like, the information that he gave was so powerful for me, because it helped me to understand that I wasn't a bad human being. Was I an addict and alcoholic? Yes. Did I make bad decisions? Yes. Was I a horrible person? No. And that was really important for me. So when the PHP staff came and said, hey, could we show maybe like an older version of it? I was like, yeah, I think I have a copy of it recorded. I was able to send it to them. And on 2 different occasions, 2 separate patients that would kind of qualify into that emerging adult population came over to our building. One of them asked Kevin, he saw Kevin, he goes, hey, the guy that does the broken brain, what's his birthday? And Kevin's like, off the top of my head, I don't know right off the top of my head, you can go ask him. And the patient comes up and goes, hey, what's your birthday? And I told him, and he goes, oh man, I know you talked about you love Edgar's cupcakes for your birthday, man. I was thinking about getting you some. And I was like, oh man, you missed my birthday, but like, you don't need to get me anything. Trust me, I got Edgar's cupcakes. Appreciate it. Right. But we developed, because of that, there's something about whatever that was that he took from that. We developed a relationship already and starting to build that trust. Then another patient said, hey, I remember in the video you talked about that you love the smell of Tommy Hilfiger cologne. And I was like, oh man, back in the day, that was it. That was the cologne. And he goes, I got some at my apartment. And I was like, oh, that's awesome, man. And he brought some the next day. And he goes, go ahead. He goes, is it still as good as you thought? And I was like, oh man, yeah, it's still good. So since that time, we've developed, right, that relationship with those patients, right? And Kevin's had multiple interactions with, different patients all throughout the building, right? PHP, IOP, that kind of qualify into that IOP or the emerging adult population. And because we're taking that time, to cut up with them, to interact with them, like, hey, I know that you were kind of in a place yesterday, like, hey, how are you doing today? Even if they're not our patients, right? It's like we're developing that relationship with these patients so that when we do have these conversations with them about the broken brain, the brain chemistry, talking about family dynamics, right? It's like we're going to have a better chance to say something that may sink into them. And so, like, that's why, like, I can't stress this enough. Any chance that you get to have an interaction, even if it's on your break, but you get to have a chance to have an interaction with a patient, emerging adult or not, doesn't matter. Take that time. If you hear them listen to a song and you know the song, like, talk about it. Because again, you have no clue how much you can build that relationship with that patient just by like one interaction that could literally shift the perspective of them being externally motivated to be here for whatever reason. And Kevin mentioned about how like the emerging adult population generally is the higher AMA risk. That interaction with them may be the thing that saves them from going AMA because they've developed that relationship with you. So I just think it's so important to reiterate that port.
Yeah, and
So
going on, like
yeah, go ahead.
when we found that data that they were the highest risk and they were leaving in droves AMA, what we did is we removed them from the co-ed groups and we created their own specific emerging adult male group. Um, they met at a different time of day. They were the only ones in the building. So we eliminated a lot of these distractions that were causing them to leave AMA. And once we did that, their AMA rate decreased significantly. I mean, they were probably the ones that were completing treatment at the highest percentage wise, because we were able to extract them and put them in an environment where they felt safe and comfortable to share. When you eliminated, you know, the co-ed population, it really allowed them to focus on themselves and each other and open up and share in a way that was so powerful to see and just an honor to be a part of that group. It was really a special time. So we're going to go into that a little later, but uh, I think part of what we need to do when dealing with emerging adults, we've got to identify their barriers, their distractions, and do the best we can as clinicians and advocates to kind of eliminate or decrease those so they can focus on themselves and begin, that healing process and that journey to recovery. So,
Yeah. And actually, Kevin and I were just talking, I think it was actually yesterday, about one group specifically that we remember from the emerging adult group that that Kevin had done group with, and like just they had like just such a bond with each other. We actually did at our Warrior inpatient facility. We have when you first go into the facility, kind of that overhead shot that you saw, right? That's kind of like our extended care program, or where it's more of the long term, and then you also have other programs that go on in there. But that's kind of was like more back in the day. That was kind of like the extended care program, and then you drove down the hill, and then you got to the big main building, which is where like administration was, the nursing station, detox, doctor's office, all that stuff. Above it was the cafeteria, and then the four kind of paths that went off of that was the cottages. And cottage one was kind of always known as kind of the misfits, right? It was usually referred to as the dog pound, because it was a bunch of like, guys that just really, and it talks about it in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It says, we're normally a group of people who normally wouldn't mix. And so you get these, younger guys together that again, probably wouldn't associate or hang out with each other on a regular basis. And so people always kind of had this negative, I don't know, kind of like, oh, there's cottage one, it was just always that kind of mindset when it came to that cottage. Well, what everybody didn't know though was I believe it was for 4 years. It was either 3 or 4 years, I believe. Cottage one had a better success rate of the patient staying sober than all the other cottages combined.
mm-hmm.
And part of that was because of the communication that they had. They built these bonds with each other, that they had not had, that they had desperately needed, that they had wanted, right? And tried to simulate through drinking and using with other people. But again, they've always kind of put on this mask. And so when they get to treatment and they actually are allowed to be themselves for the first time, and somebody in the group, let's say, takes a healthy risk, they share something that they've never shared with someone else before. And the group doesn't, pick on them or laugh at them or, oh, it's stupid. Why would you feel that way or whatever? It's like, but they really let that person share. All of a sudden it opens the door for these other patients to go, well, hey, since you shared this, let me share this. So these guys would literally have like this, I don't want to say unbreakable, but really close to unbreakable bond. And so honestly, one of them would say, well, what are you doing after you leave treatment? And they're like, well, I'm going home. Well, where are you going? Actually, I'm going to sober living. all right, maybe I'll go to sober living. And so now it's like, that's why I'm saying, like, when you get this population together, it's really special because they don't have a lot of times, the wife and the kids, right? They don't have, or the husband and the kids. They don't have the, maybe some of the things that are the career already set in place. And so they can kind of pick up and start fresh with this population and really develop this wonderful relationship with people. But the one question that always comes up, which is now kind of where we're at this with this slide, is like, well, how do we get here? Right? I think that's one thing that I struggled with when I was in treatment. And again, like I got sober at 23, I'm 42 now. And luckily thank goodness to, taking action and the willingness, right? Like I haven't found it necessary to relapse, right? I continue to still go to the, 2 meetings a week, call my sponsor twice a week, still pray and meditate throughout the day, those things. But when I was in treatment, one, I felt horrible. I felt like I was a bad human being. I felt like I was just doomed and destined to nothing. I was never going to do anything good with my life. And I remember, thinking back to like multiple people in my life saying, why do you keep doing this? Like, why? When you have everything in front of you that tells you that this is never going to go well, this is not going to be good, why do you keep doing this? And the only answer that I knew to answer was, I don't know. And I really meant it when I said it. I don't know. Because I really didn't know. I knew that I had, going into this equation, right? Pain plus blank equals relief. And in this scenario, right, we're going to look at the DOC, the drug of choice. All I knew was that I had pain. When I'm saying pain, I'm we all have physical pains, right? I mean, especially as we get older. I literally threw my back out in mid-December trying to load my kid's dirt bike up, and I threw my back out. Took like 3 weeks for it to finally get better. Probably 2 days after finally feeling better, my allergies kicked in. I sneezed, threw my back right back out again. So Kevin also is my chiropractor as well. When I'm really in pain, I did go see a legit chiropractor, but in a pinch, Kevin will help me. But we all have pain, right? When I was 12 years old was when I started using. I didn't have physical pain like I necessarily do today at 40, 42. The pain that I had was this internal discomfort. Meaning that like I could walk into a room of people that I absolutely love, that love me, but the moment I walk through the door, I feel like I'm the outsider. Like they didn't look at me different. They didn't like say anything to make me feel that way. I just walked in and I instantly felt different and less than. So I would spend a lot of my time wearing a mask, right? I would walk into that room. And look, I'm gonna dare to say that like I think some of us probably in this presentation probably could say that they've done this before. It looks like 668 people in here. I'm sure we have at some point, right, felt insecure, walked into a situation, looked at the room, and tried to become the thing or the people that we saw in that room so that we could feel more a part of, right? But that's the way I felt every day. When I'm talking about pain, right, it was this feeling of impending doom, right? That like, no matter what happens in life, something is always going to screw it up, right? Like I'm just doomed to be punished by my higher power or whatever, right? Or I'm just, if it wasn't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. I'm sure we've all heard that statement before. Some of us have probably felt that way at times in our lives, right? When we keep having multiple things going bad, we just feel like, man, if I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have anything. Pain is that part of it, that internal piece that just, I don't feel comfortable in my own skin, right? And there's a difference between that, like, well, let's say we're in the adolescent years and we're kind of in the puberty stages, right? When we're kind of going through the body transitions, the hormones, right? I mean, we're really trying to figure out who we are and we don't feel comfortable in our own skin. Like that's normal. But to have this feeling for an extended period of our life, right? That's what I'm talking about when I say that. So that's part of what I'm talking about. So like the idea of like being uncomfortable, the idea of this impending doom, um, that's the deal, right? And so anytime any of us in our lives, right, have searched, all I think anybody ever in life has always wanted was relief. I don't even necessarily want like pleasure. I just want relief, right? Um, and so we live by this equation, right? Pain plus blank equals relief. But in this scenario with addicts and alcoholics, and starting in that definitely, you know, even before, but definitely starting for sure around that emerging adult population, right? They find, for whatever reason or why, right? They find their drug of choice. And so what happens is they get the relief, and that relief is something that they desperately want. Kevin, you gave a good example yesterday about the cookout.
Yeah. It's, you know, when we say drug of choice, I always find that interesting. Like the drugs chose you, right? You know, it's the drug of choice you find through experimentation, right? It's like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's like this bed's too soft, this bed's too hard, this one's just right, right? And so through adolescence and through emerging adult, you know, when you begin experimenting, it may start off with marijuana, maybe alcohol, but eventually they find what gives them that ultimate relief, that ultimate pleasure. And when I give this presentation, I always want to point out that relief in this way is like an umbrella term, right? Because there's a lot of stuff underneath relief. It could mean a variety of different things for different people. If I polled all 679 of you in this chat, you could probably give me 679 different ways or different words that ultimately mean relief. You know, what does relief mean to you? Is it happiness? Is it numbing out your thoughts? Is it getting rid of the pain? Is it whatever it may be? Um, and so I just kind of wanted to point that out, that relief is such a broad word that it could mean a lot of different things for a variety of different people. So just kind of want to put that into y'all's wheelhouse for now to start thinking about what does relief mean for you? And what do you do for relief?
Yeah, because if you, I do this activity sometimes with patients where we look at we look at this list of values, right? I've got this like values checklist, right? It's considered family values, but I always say don't look at that, just think about values. And so I say, okay, here's what we're gonna do. I want you guys, and there's probably like I don't know 30 values that's on that list. So I usually will say, hey, I'm gonna give you 5 minutes. And I want you to think about if you could only have 5 of those values, right? What values would you pick to take you on for the rest of your life? And I'll play some music and, you know, I usually play like, you know, just something like Kaleo or something like that. Or I think Jim Hall's on this call on the Zoom too. Jim's usually like my go-to guy for music. He gives me good suggestions. To try, you know, different things. So I'll play like different music while they're working on this, right? And so at the end of the 5 minutes, they'll come up with their values. And so I'll say, okay, well, what values did you pick, and how would you define those values? And so we go through that list, and we look at the other side of that. We look at how drugs and alcohol affect those values, right? Which is drastic. But then I'll ask the question, okay, so if you were to have done this activity 5 years ago, would your answers have still been the same? 90% of the group would say, no, they would be different. Well, the reason why I bring that up is because it ties in with what Kevin's saying about relief. Relief that I had when I was 14, 15, 16 years old was different than the relief that I got at 25 years old. Relief is different today at 42 than it was at 25 years old, meaning that like relief is constantly changing. Right? Which also means other parts of our life is changing, right? A good question that I ask, you know, especially when working with emerging adults is they'll say something to the effect of, man, I just want to be happy. And I'm like, wow, all right, let's go with that, right? I'm like, what is happy? And it's amazing that there's, you know, 10 patients that are in there, 10 clients, and they all have a different answer of what happy is. Or they'll say, man, I just want to be sober and be successful. cool. What does successful mean to you? And they all have a different perspective. It's the same principle, right? When patients are out there looking for relief, because they're looking for relief for a specific reason. Could it be because they feel uncomfortable in their own skin? Sure, of course, right? There's probably that piece of it. But what if relief is the fact that they grow up in a really hard household? And that's all they want is relief. What if they grow up with a family that constantly tells them that they're no good, that they're never going to do anything great, that they always screw stuff up, right? That they, that like that's so it's like everybody's, I guess, pain threshold is different. And so like having these interactions and discussions with patients about this is like we a lot of times I think we spend so much time focused on the DOC, the drug of choice, right? Whatever they find that gives them the greatest relief in that moment, that we forget to peel back that layer of, well, what's causing the pain? But even more so is like, well, what does the drugs and alcohol give you ultimately? And I had this discussion with my group not too long ago. And I was like, well, why do y'all use? And they're like, we love the way it makes us feel. And I was like, okay, that's fair. I said, but let me ask you this. I was like, is the way that it makes you feel the primary reason why you use, or do you feel like you use primarily because it stops your brain from working? It takes away those thoughts. It takes away that pain. It takes away the grief. It takes away the trauma. It takes away the fear, the anxiety, the worry. It takes away those things. And then the secondary relief is that you get the feeling, the euphoria. And they all kind of looked for a second and they're like, you know what? Honestly, like, I think you're right. I'm ultimately using because I don't like the way I feel. And then it does that, but then it gives me the secondary feeling. So when patients come in, we want to talk to them about this equation, right? That there's pain plus a drug of choice equals relief, right? And the thing is with relief, like what Kevin said, is that relief generally doesn't last, right? If you've got something like addiction and alcoholism, the relief that you're going to get from those substances is very short term, right? As long as you're drinking and using, you're good. But the moment that you sober up, the moment that you come down, right, now you're stuck. You're back feeling those feelings. Not only are you feeling the feelings that you had before, which is why you were using in the first place, you've probably created a whole new slew of problems in your life that now boost your pain up, right? So again, the only way that I'm going to get rid of that feeling and get that relief is to actually use again. And as Kevin said, like the relief that patients have, right, is if patients could still use the same amount that they did when they first got started drinking and using, and it still worked the way that it did, patients would still be drinking and using, right? That's the reason why they eventually shift to other substances. No patient that I know of in my experience ever said, I just woke up one day and decided to do heroin, right? It usually started with some sort of an injury, generally, right? It usually started with an injury. They got prescribed an opiate. They loved the way it made them feel. And then eventually, like, they progressed. Occasionally, yes, they're going to find that somebody gives them something and they get an opiate and they like it. But a lot of times for patients, right, they're like, I never thought I'd be on heroin, but I was taking these pain pills and then it stopped working. It wasn't even cutting it anymore. And so I had to progress to something stronger. And that's how they get to that spot. But the relief that we gain is short term when it comes to drinking and using, when we put the DOC, the drug of choice, into the equation. But the thing is, with short term relief, the second thing that happens is that we gain negative consequences. And so those negative consequences could be some of the things that they deal with, right? It could be the fact that they're kicked out of school, financial issues, relationship issues, overdose, right? And near-death experience, legal issues. Maybe they're getting threatened to get kicked off the sporting team that they're on if they don't do something different. Well, imagine what negative consequences does to your pain. The answer is that it increases it. So when my pain increases, right, so does my drug of choice. And so like that's why like this whole thing is the cycle of addiction, right? It just literally feeds itself. We're never feeling like to this position of getting the actual like problem solving, right? We're just trying to find that relief. And so um, Kevin and I were talking yesterday about how um, even before patients get into, let's say, using drugs and alcohol the first time, right? They have probably put something into that DOC spot before, right? I think everybody in here has done that at some point, right? Pain plus something, we have a discomfort, right? So what do we do, right? What were some of the things that we said, Kevin, yesterday? Some of the options of things that we would put in there sometimes.
I mean, it could be like music, television, um, another relationship. It's especially early on, when you're an adolescent or that emerging adult, you have that first breakup, and you're like, oh, hell, life is over.
Yeah,
She broke my heart. And then, you're could be like somebody said, could be food. It could be a lot of different things. Like you're just trying to take that original source of pain away because we're kind of instructed throughout life that pain is bad. We don't deserve to feel pain.
mm,
Um, and so we find anything and everything to try and get rid of it. Um, and as Adam said, as the addiction begins to grow, that relief goes away, and then these negative consequences set in. And not only now am I dealing, or have I not dealt rather, with the original source of my pain, now with everything else that I've done, right? I've gone against my values, I've gone against my morals. I am doing things that I never thought I'd be doing. I'm lying, I'm stealing, I'm manipulating. I, so now I haven't dealt with that original source of my pain, but now I've actually created even more. So what do I do now?
yeah,
TikTok. There you go. That's yeah,
yeah. I was
scroll.
looking at some of
I'm
those, right?
scrolling.
Well, I was looking at some of those in the chat. Again, like yeah, TikTok, sex, food, spending money,
Yeah,
and it is yes. Brenda said it right. Yeah, it's quick relief is attractive, especially with adolescents, right? And
correct.
that's the thing. I actually looked this up yesterday because I was really interested in it. I thought about it and I looked it up. So um, the teenage population that is going into, let's say, the emerging adult kind of population, right? I was interested just to see what was different between the dopamine levels of an adult, right? Like a fully formed brain, adult, which the brain fully develops at 25 by the time they're 25, right? And then an adolescent, like kind of emerging adult speculation. So the dopamine level, which I was really kind of surprised by this, the dopamine baseline for a teenager emerging adult of dopamine was actually less than the adult. So an adult has a higher baseline of dopamine. But what does make sense is that the dopamine level that is released for adolescent, teenager, emerging adult, it's a drastic spike up. But that also means it's a really, really low. So while the emerging adult population, right, has a lower kind of here's the adult dopamine baseline and here's the emerging adult baseline, even though the emerging adult baseline is lower than the adult, when they get hit with something that's pleasurable, it sails it through the roof. Whereas an adult, it's more of like this slow, steady hill climb because again, we're able to see through kind of some of the facade, right, of these things. And so we're actually going to, let's see who put that. Lacey put TikTok on there. And we're actually going to talk about that a little bit in the second part about TikTok and Snapchat and how that affects with technology these days, right, with the emerging adult population, because you truly can get one addicted to TikTok. It's built that way to do that, right? To like scroll. But imagine too that same respect is that like things like TikTok, right? Even some of the gaming things, actually, really all the things that you guys said fits into this. Is that every one of those things increases my pain? And here's why: is that when I'm looking at TikTok and I'm scrolling through and I see that like I see this person who posted something maybe similar to me, and they got like 10 times the views or likes or whatever. I don't know what the terminology is with TikTok. I don't use it, but they got more, things, or I see somebody else and like, I feel like they're living what the life I should have. Now I'm comparing myself to somebody else. If video games is my thing, but like my pain level internally would go up playing against kids these days in video games. Like I downloaded Call of Duty not too long ago. And played online, and I was getting absolutely destroyed by 12-year-olds who were trash talking me, by the way. I had to
As
take
they
my
should.
headphone off
As they
because I was
should.
like, they're killing me. Ryan's a casual gamer over there. There you go. But I was literally getting killed, and I'm going like, I've played these games my whole life, but these kids literally focus all their energy in these games. Shopping the same way. It's like, right, we go on social media, we see somebody else that has like a new car or new shoes or new this or new that. And now I'm like, I look at all the things that I have and I'm like, well, I don't have all those good things, right? So I go out shopping to go buy the things to make me feel better, and it doesn't work. So like that's all those things of like why it's so important, right, for us to like, I've got to find something that I can fit into this equation that's going to change the bottom two outcomes, right? That I need to find something that's going to change out the negative consequences to positive consequences and short-term relief to long-term relief or long-term solution. So let me change over to the next thing. So now we've got the cycle of addiction recovery. So what we're doing is we're asking, we, family members, judges, parents, siblings, partners, whatever, is asking us, right, to take out the drug of choice in that equation. Well, when you take out the drug of choice, and let's say recovery is not even in there, right? It's just pain plus blank equals relief. It's like, well, now I'm just left with pain and no relief. And that's when patients generally will fill that void with something like what Kevin said, like when we came up with a specific program for the emerging adult men specifically, because putting a co-ed emerging adult group and together was not going to work very well because emotions have been numb, and now drugs and alcohol are out of the equation. Patients are starting to feel things again. Well, one of the things that they feel is emotions really quickly. I always tell the guys, I'm like, there's two things that you can catch in early recovery. One's a cold because your immune system's shot, and two are feelings. Because all of a sudden, like you've kind of been in this fog and this haze, and now all you see her or she sees him, and all of a sudden it's love blossoms, and we're gonna get sober together. Right. I mean, Kevin and I, we've seen this, and I know a bunch of y'all have seen this that have been in this population before. And it just doesn't work. So instead of one person kind of stifling their chances at success, now we've got two. So, but we want to find something that we can put into this equation, right, that's going to work, right? And so what we have found, which is again, like what through just over the years, has been the most evidence-based success for sobriety and clean time long-term is recovery. And so when we use the term recovery, we're talking about a few specific things in general, right? We're talking about sponsorship, meetings, prayer and meditation, step work, right? The 12 steps, and then being of service. So helping other people out, doing something. Is the 12-step program, is quote unquote the recovery thing the only method, the only way that works? Absolutely not, right? I've had patients that really got into fitness and kind of mindfulness and more of like kind of the yoga meditation thing and really got internally tapped into themselves because all of those things that I mentioned is a spiritual component. Meditation, yoga, prayer, church being a spiritual component. All those things are helping you to look internally and identifying and addressing what you feel. So it's not the only way that can work. Smart recovery, absolutely. So I think it's just really important that we make sure that that we make sure that we are not just saying that this is the only thing that works. because it's not. There's plenty of other things that work, but this is the most evidence-based that we have found that works. Kevin, do you want to add anything on this?
Yeah, and going back to the pain component, I always like to share like data and stats because a lot of us in this field kind of feed off of that. Uh, this study is a few years old. I think it was back in like 2014, so I don't even know what it would be like now, percentage wise. But going off the pain thing, like us here in America specifically, we're very egocentric, right? We think the world kind of revolves around the U.S. and everything begins and ends here. But the fact of the matter is, we only, as a population, represent 5% of the Earth, right? So that means 95% of the Earth's population live outside of our borders, right? We're only 5%. Yet this study done in 2014 found that us Americans consumed 95% of the world's pharmaceutical drugs. I'm not just talking about opiates or, antidepressants. I'm talking about erectile dysfunction, blood pressure, mood stabilizers, sleep aids, all these things that again are trying to offer relief. And I just kind of want to point that out because I find that fascinating that 5% of the world population is consuming 95% of the pharmaceutical drugs manufactured around the world. So clearly we're doing something wrong. As a society. So I'm really glad we're able to have these type of discussions because it starts with the adolescents, with the emerging adults of how to deal with things different. Somebody said earlier that comparison is very dangerous, and it is, and we're a society of comparison. So and I think
Yeah.
social media has a lot to do with that as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think again, it could be a wonderful tool, right? Because we're able to do these kind of things. We're able to do the presentations, and people can be different places, different time zones, and participate. But it does. We tend to compare ourselves for all these things now. And again, obviously, like keeping keeping what Kevin said in mind about that, about the 95%, right? It's like there are certain people out there currently right now, like, right, they're trying to shift that to something better, right? To try to let's start looking at other ways that we can deal with this. And thank goodness too, by the way, that with the shift in society, right? There has been a shift in society, right? Where let's say 30, 40 years ago, right? When I was a kid, you're told, like, if you get hurt, you're told, suck it up, buttercup, right? Like, rub some dirt on it, move on, like, get over it, and I'm grateful that, like, there's a place and time for that, right? To have, like, hey, you gotta, the kind of the tough love kind of thing, and there's a place for it, but we've shifted to where therapy and treatment is not as taboo as it was. Addiction and alcoholism isn't as taboo anymore, right? Like, you'd be real hard pressed to find somebody who didn't know somebody affected by drugs and alcohol these days. And so, and you'd be real hard pressed to find somebody in your circle that was not on antidepressants, right? And so it's like, those things are great. Like I personally, myself, I'm on an antidepressant. It helps me, but I also know that it's only helping a symptom. I've got to get to the underlying thing of, like, what's causing this. It's the same concept with patients, right? Is that we're trying to get them to understand that drugs and alcohol is just a symptom of your problem, right? At the end of the day, like, you think, okay, well, drugs and alcohol, I just need to quit drinking and using and I'll be okay. And it's like, no, if that was the case, we'd all be in great shape, right? There's I was telling Kevin about this and asked him about, he had seen it too and used it before, but some of y'all probably have. There was a great cartoon that came out in 1957. Interestingly enough, the American Medical Association classified addiction and alcoholism as a disease in 1956. So in 1957 comes out Sylvester and Tweety's cartoon, and you can look it up on if you Google Birds Anonymous Daily Motion. Daily Motion's where I generally watch the clip, because it's the only place that I found lately that actually has the full 6-minute cartoon. But I'll use it in group. And so in the cartoon, it's Sylvester and Tweety. Sylvester's like going after the bird, and he's all about the bird, turns the blinds, closes all the lights off. You see the two eyes, and then you see a random set of eyes, and a light pops on. It's another cat. And this cat goes, "Hey, listen, if birds are going to be the downfall of you. If you need help, like, why don't you meet us for our program?" And so he literally gives him the address to an alley, and he goes out there, and Sylvester goes to Birds Anonymous. And so a couple of cats stand up and talk about how birds ruined their life, and they gave up homes because of the birds and stuff. And so Sylvester says in the cartoon, he goes, "Everybody, birds are now for the birds. I'm gonna leave birds alone." Well, he goes back into the house where Tweety is. So he walks by, he's like, "Yeah, everything's good. Hey, good. How you doing?" He goes over to watch TV. Well, it's a turkey. And it looks so good on the TV, right? And he just starts, like, he gets triggered. So then he turns the TV off. He's like, "I'll just listen to the radio." Turns the radio on. It's about birds. And so, like, the whole point of, like, the deal is that, like, it's drugs and alcohol is the way that I treat the symptom. I've got to get down to the root and cause of the pain. I can take a medication for an antidepressant, right? But I've got to get down to the root and cause. Like, I can take something for heartburn, but until I figure out, right, that what's causing the heartburn, usually for me it's pizza, because I eat a lot of pizza and, like, pasta and all that stuff. But until I get down to the root cause of it, right, it's like it's only going to help me treat the symptom for that quote unquote temporary relief. And Julian said it right. Drugs and alcohol are the solution for our patients, because that's what they think, right? They think, "I'll take this substance and it makes me feel better." That's it. That's the answer. But it's not, right? Because it's only short term. So when we get patients that come into treatment, right, we're really, like, removing the drugs and the alcohol with them, and we're trying to instill the idea of recovery being the new thing. The prayer and meditation, the going to meetings, calling and getting a sponsor, 12 steps, and being of service. When they do this, all of a sudden they find that their relief has now changed from short term to long term. So the example that I use would be like, if I saw Ryan, Ryan's on here, Ryan Jackson. He's worked with us. Fantastic counselor. And let's just say that he and I, he said something that really upset me, right? He said something that I kind of felt slighted by that conversation, or whatever he said, right? So I'm mad. I've got pain. I've got internal discomfort, right? So I pick up the phone and I call my sponsor and I say, "Hey, man, you won't believe what Ryan said to me. You won't believe that this guy said this, and here's what he said. And can you believe that he said that to me?" And my sponsor, over the last 18 years, and I've had different sponsors, but every sponsor always said the same thing. They said, "Well, that's interesting. Adam, did you do anything to set the ball rolling?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" They go, "Well, did you do anything to him that you think maybe he reacted to you that way as a I don't want to say retaliatory, but as a he responded because of the way that you acted first." 99.9% of the time, looking back, I did something to set the ball rolling. Like, I did something to Ryan at first, forgot all about it, and then Ryan gave me that short response that I didn't like and was like, "What's this guy's problem?" So my sponsor's helping to turn the focus off of Ryan and putting it back on me and saying, "Well, why don't you look at yourself?" And so what happens is that now I get long-term relief, because I used to sit and stew and stuff, right? I would sit there hold grudges of for years, mad at somebody instead of talking to the person and addressing it, right? And so now it's like, well, hey, let me go to Ryan and say, "Hey, Ryan, like, I didn't understand why you said it to me that way you did, but now I understand. Hey, man, like, you know what, I was in the wrong at first, right? And all of a sudden now I've got the relationship's fixed. It doesn't have to be separated or discarded or ghosted or whatever you want to say. Like, the relationship can actually be fixed. And when I do these things, right, I get positive consequences. Positive consequences because Um, I used to sit up at night thinking like, well, why did they say this to me? Or then I would beat myself up because like, well, why didn't I should have said this back to them? I can't believe I let them say that to me, you know? And I would literally play this stuff out in my head over and over and over and over again. Well, if I see him tomorrow and he says this, well, I'm going to say that. So I would lose sleep. I wouldn't be engaged in the relationships that were in my life. I generally missed stuff in my life that I needed to be maybe more on top of. So when I'm addressing these things that day in real time, right, I'm getting the relief because I'm not taking it with me for weeks, months, whatever. And then I'm getting the positive consequences because I'm actually moving forward in my life, addressing things, having better relationships. Well, if I have positive consequences, just by nature, right? It's like I'm going to decrease my pain, which was the whole point of me drinking and using, was to decrease my pain. So my pain level goes down. Well, I'm also a creature of habit. So if my pain level is going down, meaning that like what this you're offering me, what you're telling me is working, my recovery will increase. So that's the best part of this process, is that like they're getting not only they're getting 10 times better result with putting recovery or some form of smart recovery, spirituality, exercise, yoga, whatever, into the equation than they were with drugs and alcohol in that scenario. So it's part of the process for them to understand that, like, look, you're giving up drugs and alcohol, no doubt about it, but we're giving you something that's better, that is more efficient, that's free. Like I have not been to jail in 18 years. So that's already a plus, right? Financially, right? It's like, look at how much money I spent on drinking and using that I'm not spending anymore today because of putting recovery into the mix. So, Kevin, were you going to say something? Okay. But sorry for whatever I said to you. Thank you, Ryan. I accept your apology. Um, and again, and I appreciate. I'm looking at y'all stuff. Unfortunately, Lee, we don't have a DVD of this. Again, we do have this recording, right? So we are recording this today, so you guys will all get a copy of this. So again, if you decide to, feel free to play this, right? I always tell people, I'll send it to my patients because a lot of times they'll ask for it, and I'll say, look, I'm sending this to you. Send it to family, because families don't always understand. They want to be supportive, they want to understand, but they don't exactly what's going on. They think it's a willpower issue, a moral issue, a whole slew of answers that's not necessarily accurate. So when you get a copy of this recording, you guys absolutely feel free, send this to whomever you like. And I did see, like, some of y'all saying that this really hits home what we're talking about, like describing like someone in your life, a loved one in your life. And it's um it's that's the whole correlation of this, that we're understanding and having better empathy with each other, that we, even though we're maybe professionals, clinicians in this field, right, it's like this still hits home to us. Christopher, I saw that it says there are more than one slide. So far I think there's like 6 so far that we've used. There's like 20 total, so you'll get a copy of it at the end. But yes, love the interactions, what you guys are saying. So let's go to the next one. And then Kevin's going to talk about some of the pieces of the brain.
Yeah, so when you're dealing with the brain, you're dealing with a very complex organ, right? Um, and a lot of the stuff when we talk about the brain, even medical professionals, we still don't know. But what we do know, you know the certain areas that we kind of understand more than others, is the frontal lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cerebellum. Some of you may have heard of these areas. Some of you may be the first time you've ever hearing these terms. I remember one time I gave this presentation to a group of patients, and I was going over the hippocampus, and at the end of it, I was like, All right, so what are we taking away from this? And one of them, I don't know if he was being facetious or still in kind of coming off detox meds, but what he took away was that he had a hippopotamus in his brain, and he really enjoyed that. Uh, but the frontal lobe is located in the front part of our brain, right behind your forehead here. And our frontal lobe is associated with decision making, problem solving, and voluntary movement. So everything we do movement wise is being directed through the frontal lobe. And again, it's located right here behind your forehead. And again, very important in the process of decision making, problem solving. It allows us really to do what we do on a day to day basis, the decisions we make. It allows us to work, right? And a lot of us are therapists. So, how do we come up with problem solving for our patients? How do we come up with treatment plans? Our frontal lobe is very crucial in that process, and it allows us to do that. But it also has a very big piece to deal with when it comes to addiction. And then the hippocampus is located right in the middle of your brain, kind of between the temples, kind of in that area there. Um, it's situated in the temporal lobe, right? And it plays a key role in memory formation. Think of your hippocampus as like the brain's video recorder, right? If you grew up like me in the 80s, early 90s, you always went on a family vacation and one, mom or dad or whoever had the big camera, the RVC camera, and they were recording everything so you could have the home movies. Now we all have smartphones, so those are capturing all the memories and the images, the photos of everything. Um, so your hippocampus is really the brain's iPhone, essentially. It's recording everything and creating these memories. And through that, you can almost kind of tell the future by your hippocampus, right? And I was talking to Adam about this yesterday. By making memories, we can predict the future. We can predict future behavior from somebody, right? So the example I give is, let's say you're invited to a cookout, right? It's outdoor. Maybe it's at a friend's house who has a pool. So you get invited to this gathering, this social gathering, a cookout, whatever. So you decide you want to go, right? So you attend this cookout. The weather's fantastic. Everybody's having a good time. The pool's warm. The grill's going. And all your favorite meats and sides, everything's there. The host is very cordial, very welcoming. Um, you're having a great time, right? And at the end of it, you're like, wow, man, this was a really great party, right? I'm really glad I came. Well, 2 months later, if you get an invite from that same host, what are you most likely to do? You're probably going to attend because you have that great memory of the party from 2 months ago. Now, let's say on the flip side of that, you get invited to a party, same host, right? And it's outside, it's a cookout, but you get there and there's not a whole lot of people there. People are rude. Nobody's really talking to anybody. It may be raining, so you can't get in the pool. It's lightning. You can't keep the grill lit because of the rain. The host is being a jerk. The food's garbage, right, Claire? It's just a terrible time, right? And you're thinking, man, I hate that I even showed up. The host is being a jerk. Everybody's kind of rude and dismissive, right? And you leave there driving home thinking, that was terrible. And 2 months later, right, you get an invite from that same host. What are you most likely to do? Probably not go, right? And you're making those decisions through the frontal lobe because of the memory formation that the hippocampus has recorded, right? In the first scenario, you're going to go back to that party because you have a great memory. And that second one, you're probably not going to go back because you'd had a terrible experience. So we can almost predict future behavior in this way by just understanding the role of decision making and memory formation in those two functions of the brain. Um, so now I'll turn it over to Adam to discuss the amygdala and the cerebellum and what their role is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier about the cookout example, because it really was helpful, right, to understand that. Like, we constantly go back to, like I said, creatures of habit, what works. There's some people out there who love to change things up, right? And that they enjoy the idea of like trying new things, going new places, right? But a lot of times people really enjoy structure and routine. So it's like if you know you've had a bad experience with something, right? It's like, yeah, you're probably not going to go back to that experience. But that's the weird thing with addiction and alcoholism, right? Is that like patients can have a bad experience with drugs and alcohol, but because they they got set like even if it's a momentary relief, drastic boost of dopamine, all that stuff, right? Then it's like all of a sudden they feel so much better. And so even though like I used the example a couple of years ago when I did the broken brain about like when I used the very first time, I had a certain block of time to be at my friend's house. That I told my parents I was going over to hang out and play. And instead of like using right when I got there, right? Like I waited almost till the end of the time of my time to be there to actually use. And so I experienced like this 10 minutes of like, oh my gosh, this euphoric outer body, like spiritual experience. I finally feel one with the earth, connected, whatever. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, I have to be home. And I had to deal with like 48 hours of terror. Like, did my parents know, all this stuff, right? Trying to like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be busted, consequences, all this stuff. And what I said then, and I still say a lot now, is that the the experience, the 10 minutes of pleasure that I experienced, the 10 minutes of like euphoria, spiritual experience, outer body kind of thing, like feeling one with myself, was stronger than 48 hours of pain. So I was like, I'll take 10 minutes of relief and the 48 hours of pain if I have to, right? Because like my brain has recorded like what he was talking about, the recording. There's actually a really good Black Mirror episode. I don't know if anybody watched the Black Mirror. Probably a few they do. But there was a like where you could see and it was recording through your eyes like these experiences, and that's kind of how the hippocampus works. Deborah likes it. There you go. So it's like your brain's recording this, and my brain, and here's the thing: is like my brain forgets also, right? I was telling the patients this week, I have a brain that I'm a slow learner and a fast forgetter, right? Like I'm one of those people, man. I'm slow to like like learn the right way to do something. It takes me a minute, right? A couple of times, bump my head a few times, right? But then like I'll forget how bad like that pain was. That's why addiction's so hard, because like it takes patients a minute to get to that spot of getting sober, right? But then as the longer they stay sober, they forget how bad it was, right? That's why like staying connected in recovery is so beneficial to us, the anchor, because if I forget where I came from, right? If I forget how bad it was, if I'm not around people in recovery, it's going to be easy for me to go like, oh, I can't, it really wasn't that bad, was it? And so like, I've got to keep that part of my brain like really kind of connected and used. But like what Kevin said, so we've got the frontal lobe and the hippocampus, but then also in the temporal lobe it's crucial for emotional processing and reactions is the amygdala. So anytime that you're feeling any type of a feeling, any type of an emotion, right, it's being processed through the amygdala. And so it's, that's a drastically important part of it. Now, most patients will say this, they agree with this. By the time they get to treatment, the only thing that they generally know how to feel genuinely is anger and depression. But we all know that there's multiple feelings, more than that. And there's a reason why they only feel a certain amount of feelings when it comes to that. And that's part of the process where the brain kind of starts to shut down. But the amygdala is where it registers those emotional responses. So when we're going through an experience, when we're going through, again, good, bad, indifferent, doesn't matter. It's being played out through the amygdala. And then the cerebellum is, it's what I really refer to as, it's kind of your primitive brain, right? It's the survival part of your brain. It's found in the back of your brain, close to the brain stem. And it's like, it's responsible for motor control, balance, and coordination. But the other part of that that your cerebellum is responsible for is it's the fight or flight part of your brain, right? The whole purpose of the cerebellum, really, if you really want to just kind of get down to like the brass tacks, layman terms, its job is to protect me from me. So to give you the example, and let me go ahead and I'll shift the slides. So we have that really beautiful picture, but in order to kind of do this, I guess kind of in like Kevin said, kind of like the simplistic layman terms, right? This is the way that normally when we're doing this on like the dry erase board or whatever, like we would do this, but because it's a PowerPoint, kind of have to work through it. But this is basically like a very cool third grader's view of the brain. So just to simplify everything. So frontal lobe, right? The chewing gum cloud deal, right, would be considered the amygdala. The back of your brain is going to be like childbirth, pain forgotten by the next kid. Yes. And then, yeah, cues for an Thank you. So you got the cerebellum, and then in the middle, and again, we've kind of got these deals. The solid line, right, is going to be the neurotransmitter pathways. Now, I always refer to this as like bridges. So if you think about the bridge between Miami and Key West, right, it connects the two places together. So you've got 5 bridges, 5 neurotransmitter pathways. And then the only way I know how to describe this, and I've drawn this picture 100 times, more than that probably. It's either like a sideways salt shaker or the eye and lashes. But that is where like the dopamine receptors come off of the deal. And then so you've got like this whole process of how the brain works. And so what we've got here, excuse me. So now it's kind of like, this is kind of like the whole process of what the brain works like. So if you imagine like putting someone under a PET scan, right? We've learned a lot about addiction and alcoholism in the last 20 years, a lot, because of technology, improvements to technology, right? Before, like I said earlier, it was like a willpower issue. It was a moral issue, right? That's how people looked at it. It was a choice, which when someone says that an addict and alcoholic drinking and using is a choice, they're partly right, right? And I can say that as an addict and alcoholic. They're partly right because when I first started using, it was a choice. I chose that I didn't like the way that I felt. I chose that I felt uncomfortable. I chose that I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin, right? And I wanted to change how I felt in that moment. So I chose to use. And once I found like, oh my gosh, this works, I feel comfortable in my own skin, I chose not to develop any other coping skills after that. But there was a point in time when I was like, well, I don't really want to do this anymore. And my brain's like, it doesn't matter what you want to do, right? You're going to do it anyway. That's when I lost the ability to have that choice. But when people say sometimes it's like, well, them drinking and using was a choice. It's like, yeah, that's true. But at the same time, it's partly true. But if you put addicts and alcoholics right in a PET scan, right, which is like an MRI on steroids, you would see kind of this process work between like the frontal lobe, right, to the green arrow, then goes to the amygdala, right? So frontal lobe is like I'm making a decision about something. Then the decision has the chain reaction to the amygdala, which from the decision creates an emotional response. Then the amygdala for emotional response sends a signal to the cerebellum, which says, hey, fight or flight, protect yourself, do what you need to do. It makes a decision, and then it sends chemicals down these bridges, the neurotransmitter pathways, and then the red dots show up, right? And the red dots is dopamine. It's the feel-good chemical. So anytime you do something in your life that you get pleasure from, a feel-good chemical, right? It's because of dopamine is being released into your body. So, and it could be anything from somebody does something nice for you, you get complimented, you do something nice for someone else, your favorite sports team wins, exercise generally does that, sex releases dopamine, favorite meal. I mean, literally the list goes on and on of how many different ways and avenues that we can get dopamine in our bodies, feel good chemical. But in the scenario that I always use, and let me go back to the cerebellum too really quick, is that, you know, like I said, the cerebellum's job is to protect me from me. So to give an example, and again, it's going to be far-fetched, but just go with me on this for a second. If I told you guys that after this presentation today, I'm going to go home and I'm going to attempt to end my life, right? And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to lay on my bed and I'm going to hold my breath until life is over. Y'all would all probably go, that's not going to work, right? So here I am, I'm making a decision in my frontal lobe, right? I'm using my rational decision making, my processing, my brain. And so I say, I'm going to end my life. Usually the feeling attached to that is depression. By the time it gets to my cerebellum goes, yeah, you can't do that, right? Because as y'all know, you can hold your breath as long as you want. Worst case scenario, you pass out, right? But like, you're not going to die from holding your breath. It's not going to happen. Because the moment I lose consciousness, my cerebellum kicks in and says, hey, this guy needs to breathe, so go ahead and breathe. And so it kind of vetoes my order from the frontal lobe and says, you're not going to do this. And it overrides it. So my cerebellum has the ability to override my frontal lobe. So I can make a decision here, right? Just like an addict and alcoholic could say, I'm not using today. I'm done. This is it. I'm done with this, right? I make a legit conscious decision, right? My frontal lobe. My amygdala registers determination. Like I'm determined. I'm not using today. My cerebellum says, I don't care what you think you're doing. You're using, because if you don't, you're going to die. So my cerebellum will outrank my frontal lobe, right? But if you put, and I'm going to use my sister as an example because she's not an addict. She's not an addict. She's not an alcoholic, right? I mean, she'll tell you like, hey, I've got my own things, but like she's not an addict alcoholic. This is what her brain would look like if you put her under a PET scan, right? And so you would see all the makings, the frontal lobe, you would see the amygdala, you would see the cerebellum, you would see like the interaction between those three. You would be able to see the chemical go down the bridges of the neurotransmitter pathways. You would see the dopamine receptors fire off, and you would see dopamine fire off into the frontal lobe. But there's a reason that there's a difference between an addict and an alcoholic and a non-addict and a non-alcoholic, right? Is that there's something that has to change to make that happen. And this is where we go into this next, again, slide. I was just looking back at some of the things. I was looking back at what Amanda was saying about the concept of choice being arguable. And I agree. I mean, I really do. I think I just look back on it when I looked at it as like I didn't really know any better way to cope with life because again, my family didn't really talk about life. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't talk about what was going on. We just kind of ignored it. And at the time, it seemed like it was the only thing that I could do to fix that relief. But that's a good point. But what happens in the brain, going back to what separates the addict alcoholic, the non-addict, the non-alcoholic is in the neurotransmitter pathway, in these bridges, these 5 bridges, you can see the gaps. The gaps to me now, when I do it like this, always reminds me of the old school Donkey Kong game, I think on Atari. I'm sure some of y'all remember Atari, but it's kind of like that. You got to climb up the ladder, jump over the barrel, climb back up the ladder, all that stuff. It always reminds me of that when I see it. But what happens is that the gaps form in the neurotransmitter pathways, okay? Meaning that like the chemicals that are supposed to go, so you have a frontal lobe, you have a situation in life, it sends a signal to the amygdala, registers an emotional response, oh my gosh, this is happening, sends a signal to the cerebellum, hey, we need to do something. The cerebellum goes into action and it's going to send chemicals down the neurotransmitter pathways. Well, imagine though that if the gap's there, it can't cross. So the chemical, once it gets to kind of, and really it starts with like one gap, generally in the neurotransmitter pathways. But the more that we drink and use, the more that patients drink and use longer, the more damage that they do to the other pathways. So more bridges get damaged, meaning less and less and less chemical, dopamine, things like that get passed down the neurotransmitter pathway. So that's why, like when we're talking about like how important it is working with the emerging adults, it's like because if we can stop them when they're really only at that one gap that's damaged or 2, like they're in a much better position to have a healthier, longer, right? Like more fulfilling life, where it's less hard for them to recover than say somebody with like all five pathways, which they still can recover, but they're going to have to like it's longer recovery time, more work, all those kind of things. But one of the questions that people generally ask, and Kevin's going to kind of talk about some of this stuff, is what creates these gaps, right? So like we see that a gap's formed, right? But what actually creates the gaps in the neurotransmitter pathways? Kevin, do you want to talk about some of those that we've listed?
Sure. As Adam has listed here, a variety of different things can create these gaps, specifically blunt force trauma to the head, traumatic brain injuries. And you see this a lot with folks who go to war, who may experience a TBI during wartime. But we also see it a lot in those who play sports, specifically football, um, professional wrestling. Even though it may be scripted, the falls and the bumps that they take and the hits to the head is very real. Patrick says hockey, absolutely. So any contact sport where you're getting repeatedly hit in the head, could cause a disruption or a dysregulation in these gaps. And we're seeing it now, specifically in the NFL with CTE, right? All the information and all the data that is coming through with CTE and concussions, all of that is important. And you see a lot of when these sports figures, die and donate their brain, they're starting to see, damage to the gray matter of the brain, and the decision making, damage to the amygdala and things like that. So blunt force trauma can definitely cause these things. And you see, especially with some of these athletes, the more famous ones, they kind of their behavior shifts dramatically, to where they become more violent, or they're making strange decisions, or they may themselves become addicted to alcohol or drugs. So that's very common. And yeah, everybody, um, domestic violence, absolutely. Just repeated blows to the head, blunt force trauma to the head, you're going to see some disruption in these gaps. Um, Having a degree or a temperature of 105 degrees or more for longer than 2 days, um, that can happen. That can disrupt the regulation of a brain. So that is why it's so important, especially as a young, if you're a young child, if you have children, to get them to the emergency room ASAP, because that high of a temperature is doing a lot of unseen damage within the brain. So a 105-degree temp for longer than 2 days, that's a definitely high risk factor. And then PTSD, right? That's a big one. Going on, people who go to war, people who've experienced domestic violence, people who've experienced just, what it could be a natural disaster, a car wreck, whatever it may be, right? Anytime you're dealing with post-traumatic stress, as therapists, we have to kind of break that down into a big T trauma and a little T trauma. And I don't know if you've ever kind of heard it put that way, but a big T trauma is understood as traumatic by 10 out of 10 people. I take a poll and I throw out a situation. 10 out of 10 people would correctly say, yes, that is traumatic. Absolutely. Little T trauma is more subjective, right? It's subjective to the individual. But little T trauma could be like divorce, a breakup. It could be a car wreck, right? It's really subjective to the individual. Big T trauma are things like sexual abuse, going to war, being in a natural disaster, being in a severe accident. Those things are traumatic. And what we also have to understand too, and Adam and I were talking about these yesterday, is he and I could go through the exact same experience down to the minute and come out the other side with vastly different perspectives of what occurred. Right? We could go like if soldiers go to war, that's the easiest thing to understand. Two soldiers go to war, right, and go through an experience, right? Maybe they're bogged down by enemy fire for however many hours, understandably completely tragic, right? When that event is over, they go back to the barracks, they go back to the base, and they're kind of decompressing. And the next day they wake up and Soldier A just puts his uniform on or her uniform on, gets back in line, and it's business as usual. Whereas Soldier B can't even get out of bed. They don't know what's happened. They can't make sense of what occurred. Their brain is kind of stuck in this re-looping of the memory, and they can't get it out. So there's where the PTSD is beginning to form. Where Soldier A is just like, that was a Tuesday. We're here to do a job. Let's go. And Soldier B is like, I don't know how to do anything. Right? I don't even know how to put on my uniform. That doesn't even, compute to me. So we have to understand that even though you go through something traumatic, it may not form PTSD. Successive little T traumas, yes, could turn into big T. That could most certainly occur. And then this last one here, over the past few years, with the rise in different weight loss surgeries, the lap bands and things like that, we're seeing a high correlation of those folks that have gone through weight loss surgery form some type of addiction, whether opiates or alcohol. That is a high correlation. And the thought there is that the addiction was already there, but it was in the form of food, right? So no matter what the addiction, it could be alcohol, drugs, food, sex, gambling, it doesn't matter. It's all activating what Adam has illustrated here. It's all activating that reward system. I eat, I get a reward. I went on the roulette table, I get a reward. I have a successful hookup, that's a reward. So on down the line, right? So I think we have to kind of go back to that too. The addiction was already there just in the form of food. And now with the weight loss surgery, you prescribe pain medication, or now that you return to casual drinking, since the stomach has shrunk, it's being absorbed a lot more. So therein could lie the issue there, or the correlation with the weight loss surgery. And then kind of going back to the amygdala, right? That little cloud up at the top in the middle. When you do a PET scan, if you did a PET scan of somebody in active addiction, the amygdala would be significantly darkened, right? It would kind of be turned down a little bit. What's interesting is if you do a PET scan on a true blue sociopath, the amygdala is almost identical. And that's very important for this discussion, because I'm not saying that people with addiction are sociopaths per se. They're not, but they're acting like that, right? So this is where they start beginning to engage in behaviors that normally they would not. And that is because that amygdala has been turned off a little bit, or turned down. So they're engaging in manipulative acts. They are going against their morals and their values that they have been taught all their life, against right or wrong. Now they're going against that. They're doing things that otherwise they wouldn't be doing if it weren't for the addiction component, right? And they know they're doing that. They know what they're doing is wrong, right? It's just they have to do it. As Adam said, the cerebellum saying, you either do this or you will die, right? The cerebellum is the reptilian part of our brain. It's kind of what makes us more animalistic, right? It's very primate, it's very primitive. So it's really kind of calling all the shots at this point.
Yeah, and to tie in with what you're saying about that is that, we looked at earlier we referenced the hippocampus, right? So that it collects memories. And so basically it takes these filing cabinet memories and files them away, but where it files them is back in the cerebellum. So it kind of like takes the memory from the frontal lobe and then kind of shifts it all the way back to the cerebellum, so that my cerebellum can look at the experience that I'm going through and say, okay, well, is this good or bad? Like, do I need to like protect myself? Is it okay for me to stay where I'm at? And so like those memories are disconnected from once it happens, and kind of floats back to the cerebellum and sits. But something else that I wanted to touch on was that it's right at 3% of patients, right, are born with the gaps already formed inside of their pathways. So a patient literally, like, they labor goes through, then delivery, and then boom, like the child's born and they're good, right? But the moment they take that first breath out, right, it's like that gap's already formed. So all it's going to take for them is to use that substance the first time, and then it's, Katie bar the door, they're rocking and rolling. But it's less than, it's right about 3%, 2.97, somewhere around that, I think that. But in order to have qualified for that, right, the patient has to have had a long history of substance and alcohol abuse in the family, and the mother had to have been an active user throughout pregnancy. So that's only about 3% of the population of addicts and alcoholics, right, are going to qualify for that. The rest of the patients, right, this is where these things like the blunt force trauma to the head, the 105 degrees temperature, the PTSD, weight loss, like that's the thing that can open up that gap if they're not qualified in that 3%. And something I wanted to add to what Kevin said was that, with the 105-degree temperature, right, because a child's temperature can go up a lot higher than an adult generally. It's not uncommon for patients, when you have a kid to see a temperature of like 103, right, maybe even 104. So they can definitely, experience that. But the other thing that sends your brain up past 105 is ecstasy. So ecstasy actually sends your brain up to around 107. So ecstasy is doing damage that, like, whatever damage it's doing it. Like, there's no kind of reversing that. So whatever brain cells on that spot or whatever pathway part of it was burned, it's burnt, right? There's no kind of repairing on that. So that's what I'll tell patients. I'm like, well, how many people have had a temperature of 105 degrees for more than 2 days? And a lot of people don't. They're like, no, I definitely don't remember that. But then I say, well, how many people have used ecstasy 2 days in a row? And like, I'd say 30% of the room has probably raised their hand. And so you're like, okay, well, you qualify. And Kevin and I were talking about this yesterday. You don't really see, ecstasy is not something that we've seen a lot lately. It generally is in the emerging adult population more so than not. But I think there's been enough information out there that people have kind of shifted away from it. It's still definitely popular, I'm sure, in certain circumstances and circles. But generally, I was trying to think yesterday over the last year how many patients that I've had that, they took within the last year, and I really couldn't think of really anybody. But again, with blunt force trauma, right? We mentioned a lot of the sports in there. People mentioned like hockey and things like that, football, soccer. Lacrosse, a lot of different ones. Even like gymnastics, right? If you have someone doing gymnastics, right, and they're doing like some kind of a tumbling routine, and they're working on a backhand spring and something happens, they slip, right, and they bust their head, they hit their head, right, and maybe they don't have like a super big knot, but there's a chance that they could get a concussion, and there's a lot of studies lately about looking at like micro concussions, right? Like certain events, like even a jet ski, right? Like doing that, your brain's literally shaking and rattling around. Does it do damage? We're trying to figure that out now. But PTSD, again, also with Kevin used the example of the military, which is rightfully so. Also, too, though, first responders, police officers, right? Every time they go to a car, they have no clue like what the other person's intentions are. Do they have a weapon with them, right? Who are they stopping? Going into a domestic violence scenario, right? That somebody had put like about domestic violence and strangulation. It's like you never know what you're going into in that kind of experience. So they're experiencing these micro PTSD, a lot of times major T, right? But also a lot of like these micro T traumas. Firefighters and EMS, right? When they're going to work these accidents, right? Sometimes have children in there, right? And you're seeing things like no one wants to see an accident, but I for sure don't want to see an accident with a child involved, right? But they're having to see these things and then do what their job is supposed to be and then go, okay, let's go to the next call, right? And so like they don't get a chance to really process that. And again, being in a lot of those more kind of I don't want to say like male dominated, right? But more of like a, kind of the masculine mentality of like, suck it up, right? I mean, like, we don't talk about our feelings kind of thing, right? They're all kind of forced to not talk about it. Well, they don't want to talk about it at home either. So they hold it in, right? And you've got, like I said, I mean, hospital workers, even 911 operators. And our reason why I say this is because I actually had a patient who, when I covered some of this, she was like, could you include us? Because we literally have to deal with like someone's most traumatic experience and moment, try to coordinate to get the help they need. And then once that's, police officers there, EMS, whatever's there, and we hang up, it's like we get like 3 seconds and then it's like 911, right? And they go right into the next call. So they don't have a lot of time to process that. So it's just some of those examples of that, like of how it's interesting to remember that we don't think about that. And yeah, there you go. She put that in there.
Yeah. And too,
and
like
988 operators too. Yes.
Yeah, and we saw a lot, or we are seeing a lot now that we're kind of on the other side 5 years later of COVID. A lot of people formed an addiction or addiction to alcohol or drugs throughout the course of COVID, being on the front lines, being in the ER, dealing with an unprecedented environmental event and a pandemic. A lot of our patients now in the healthcare field are directly linking being on the front lines of COVID to their addiction. So I think we're going to see a lot of that as we move forward throughout the years of people negatively impacted by this pandemic, more so than we know. And then going on the PTSD route as well, I just want to point out that, data, again, in the research suggests that females in addiction, around 75% or more of them have been a victim of some form of sexual assault. So I want that I don't want that to go unnoticed. So about 75% or more of females in addiction have been sexually assaulted at one point or more in their life.
Yeah. And that's where, like we were talking about earlier, about how like when you get with kind of this population, right? And these patients have a lot of not only stress and anxiety, right, but really guilt and shame because of maybe like what Kevin said, like, maybe some of the behaviors that they were doing, right? But then also some of the things that happened to them. Some people were using because of traumas that they experienced in life, right? That's why they were using. And so they felt so isolated, so alone, right? And then they finally get to treatment and they get around these people who seem to be, they seem to like, it's like they're sharing their experience and it's like, oh my gosh, your experience is matching up with my experience. And that's the amazing thing that happens, is that they go, oh my gosh, like I'm not alone. And they start building these bonds, these I mean, it's referred to a lot of times as trauma bonds, right? But they're building these bonds with each other that they can share, they can open up, and they can talk about. Madeline, sorry, question. So with weight loss, what happens is that because food, and Kevin said this earlier, like you're looking at food was at the time, going back to the equation, pain plus blank equals relief. The DOC for somebody with that surgery, right, is food. Food is the medicator for them, right? They eat to make themselves feel happy, but or to make them feel themselves feel okay. But then they, but it's the same thing. Like drugs and alcohol make them feel better, but then drugs and alcohol makes them feel worse too. Same thing with food. So now when somebody has weight loss surgery, they can't eat as much, which is kind of depressing, right? Because that was their thing, and they could be very much a normal drinker prior to this. But what happens is because of the surgery and the way that the surgery is done, and because of like things are kind of like shifted and cut out and organized in the body differently, one drink for somebody with weight loss surgery is them drinking the equivalent of 3 drinks. So it hits them the strength 3 times harder. It also does the damage more. I'll give you a personal example. Like, so my dad at his heaviest was 450 pounds. He was 6 foot, 450 pounds. I saw the man drink twice in my entire life. He drove me to treatment. After I got sober, or actually probably right before, maybe like a year before I got sober, he had the weight loss surgery. And by the time he passed away, he was probably 150 pounds, right? So 450 to 150 pounds. He died because of his alcoholism. But he was probably 50. I think somewhere around that age range. But again, before for whatever, for that whole period of his life, 45 years of his life up to that point, right? I saw the man drink twice. But because of his addiction and alcoholism that he developed after the surgery, because again, like he couldn't eat as much, but he drank. So he got drastic improvements of dopamine for the food. So it just now became the new thing. So it's like, oh, I'm just going to separate food now with alcoholism. But because there's damage to the body done, and the alcoholism is already damaging itself, it's opening those gaps. So yeah, cross addiction. So it's really interesting. And actually Bradford did a study over like a 24-month period, and we looked at it. And it was like at any one of our 2 inpatient facilities at the time, we had somewhere between 25 and 30% of our population had either gastric bypass, right? Like one of the lap band, whatever. And of all of the 30%, 100% were alcoholics. You didn't generally see a lot with the pills. You did later in certain areas if they had already had pill addictions prior to that, but generally you'll see where they were a normal drinker before they had the surgery, and now all of a sudden like they're alcoholic and they can't figure out why. And so it's easy for us to kind of, help them kind of see that. And there's more and more studies that are out there that's kind of, again, reinforcing this. But we'll look at this last, I think it's, look, is it? Yeah, last 2 slides of this, and we'll take our break. But this is basically, so what happens is that my brain, once these gaps form, meaning that less dopamine is getting down the pathway, each one of these pathways is associated with different types of chemicals like GABA, serotonin, epinephrine, things like that. But they're also each associated with a different kind of drug class. And I'm going to send I have this thing that I found yesterday. I'll send it to Bailey so that he can include this with the slide, but it actually talked about all the substances, what it does, and then it talked about all the chemicals in the brain and what's affected, what drugs mimic it. So it's pretty good. It's 1 page, but it'll be helpful for y'all. But what happens is that, so when these gaps are formed, right, all the chemical that can't go down that pathway and go across turns around and sits back in the cerebellum area, right? And it waits for the construction to get complete, right? For the bridge to fill its void. Well, the only time that it'll cross is when you use the substance that is attached to that pathway. What's interesting though, alcohol is a universal adapter. So if you have 5 pathways with 5 damages, right? Alcohol, if you drink, will fill every one of those gaps, meaning that all that chemical that's been sitting back there in your cerebellum that's supposed to go forward, right, now rushes to your frontal lobe, and it floods the frontal lobe with dopamine, the feel-good chemical, which is why patients will tell you like, oh my gosh, like, man, the first time or, first few times I used, it was this spiritual outer body experience. Well, because their body had the gaps and all that chemical came rushing forward. So they were getting 10 times the amount of dopamine that somebody else would. And that's why it felt so good to them. But the problem is that once that chain reaction happens and all that chemical goes forward to the frontal lobe, my brain goes, well, hold on a second. Wait a second. This isn't right. So my brain's like, well, wait a second. Kevin's brain, like, it should be getting at max 200% dopamine. So 2 full blasts of dopamine at any given time. That's the most he's supposed to be getting. Hold on a second. We're registering in the brain that Kevin's getting 1,000%. He's getting 5 times more than he's supposed to. So my dopamine receptors, the eyelashes attached to the eye, that's kind of the way I put it, starts to shut itself down. So it literally starts to like disappear to where that's interesting to say. 5 eyelashes turn into now 4, then to 3, then to 2. So now I've only got maybe, let's say 2 eyelashes, right? Pathways for the dopamine to go out, which is why you get this kind of very bland, non-existent red dot dopamine, meaning that you're getting the absolute bare minimum amount of dopamine that your brain can function with, because your brain is trying to counter how much dopamine you're getting with what you're supposed to be getting, and it overcorrects. So now you're getting nothing. And then I don't know even how to explain this, but like the red wig over the amygdala, is basically like a ceiling cap, meaning that, like, that's what I was saying earlier about how by the time addicts and alcoholics get to treatment, they generally only know a couple of feelings that they can register on a regular, like, day. Usually anger, depression, blah, whatever. Like, it's never joy, it's never happy, it's never hopeful, optimistic, it's never like determined, it's never any of those things. It's generally just kind of that stuff. So the ceiling cap forms for the brain, right? And so what happens, and I'm just going to go back to this last slide real quick before we take a break, is that at around 90 days, okay, of no drugs, no alcohol, right? Exercising, eating better, getting more sleep. These eyelashes, that's just the best way to describe it, they begin to repair. So the eyelashes begin to grow themselves back. It takes generally about a full year, right, for them to fully, the dopamine receptors to fully grow themselves back all the way to kind of where they were, where they're supposed to be. But around the 90-day mark, it starts the process. The same thing with the amygdala, but it's actually a lot faster. For some people, it could be around the average of 90 days, but generally within like 7 days of stopping drinking and using, that ceiling cap that was kind of over the amygdala, that kind of blocked a lot of the emotional responses, it starts to dissipate after that first, few days, 7 days of no drugs, no alcohol, eating better, exercising, getting more rest. Meaning that patients start feeling feelings, which is also why it's, like I said, you got to have kind of a thick skin to work with the emerging adult population, because they're brutal, right? I mean, they can, emotionally, like, they're raw, they're hypersensitive to what's going on. And so, like, the smallest thing that I think, going back to like what Kevin was talking about, like something that's not that big of a deal to me could be a big deal to them. I have to take that into consideration when I'm working with emerging adults, especially when they're first getting clean and sober, that, like, I may say, hey man, I need you to, get up and come downstairs for group. And they may go like off the handle. And I'm like, why are they, like, all I asked them to do is come down the stairs. Well, I have to remember their amygdala is starting to fire again. So emotions are getting jumbled. And it's really important for me to remember that and take that into consideration. But the amygdala begins to repair itself. And it didn't transfer when I did the slides. I sent some over and we kind of coordinated with IT to kind of get this thing over. It didn't translate, I think, like what it was supposed to do. But I actually have like it's the picture of the gaps in the neurotransmitter pathways here. But what happens is that around 90 days, staying clean, staying sober, exercising, eating better, getting more rest, what they found was, doing studies, that at around 90 days of doing those things, this little like kind of chain link fence formed where the gaps were. So the gaps didn't close all the way, right? But a little chain link fence formed so that the chemical could go down, dips off for a second, and then catches back up, and then it goes into the frontal lobe. Once a gap is formed into that neurotransmitter pathway, that gap's open. It's going to be there for the rest of our lives until maybe science figures out how to close it all the way. But what we have, though, is an opportunity to when we're working this program, and like I said, exercising, spiritual connection, eating better, getting more rest, right? Doing those things, this little chain link fence forms. But they actually found that when patients stopped doing that in the studies, when they stopped doing those things, stopped exercising, getting more rest, eating healthier, working a spiritual program, those chain link fences disappeared, which is really interesting. And so they actually had the same people who they told to stop doing those things. They said, go back and do it again. Go back and do the spiritual connection, exercise, eat better, get more rest. They brought them back in after 90 days and they noticed the chain link fence was back, which is really incredible. And again, we still don't know exactly how it works or why it works. We just know that it does. So if a patient is an addict and alcoholic, right, it's no different than if somebody gets told by their doctor, hey, you're a diabetic, right? Is their life over? No. Are they going to have to be a lot more observant of themselves and practice observation, self-care routine? Yes. Same thing with patients in addiction and alcoholism. Their life's not over. In fact, a lot of times patients will tell you their life starts when they get sober. They actually learn how to live. But they are going to have to be aware of themselves. They're going to have to be aware of that spiritual connection and how important that is. They're going to have to be mindful of like what they're eating and taking their medications the way that they're supposed to and not forgetting and just say, well, I'll catch it tomorrow. It's like they've got to be mindful of this stuff. But if they do those small things, they can live a really awesome life and really have like some incredible experience. Let's do the break though. And then Kevin, do we want to do 5 or 10 minutes?
We could do, what is it, 11? Let's keep it to 5.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do 5 minutes. We'll come back in. And again, it's just a reminder, we'll send all this stuff out to you guys. We'll send the slides. And we'll have this recording. But yeah, so we'll do 5 minutes and we'll come back in and then we'll go to the second part specifically about the emerging adult. as we start coming back in. Again, this has been really, like I said, a lot of fun. I love being able to see the chats. I was able to go back through and look at them. Also saw in the Q&A was Mark Driscoll. So hello, Mark. Mark worked with us over here at the IOP office. So it's really cool. And there was definitely a lot of good stuff in here. Again, I saw that about, I think Linda put about alcohol being one of the hardest. And it really is. A lot of times people think that like heroin and all that stuff is hard. And it is, no doubt about it. But you're absolutely right. Like alcohol is really hard because it's everywhere. It's in gas stations. Like Kevin was talking about with COVID, you could get it delivered to your front door. So it's, it's on TV, sporting events everywhere. So it is really a challenge. But that's the other thing about, I wanted to hit on this real quick, is that some people don't realize that, like, if your substance is, let's just say opiates, right? But you can drink, you don't have a problem with drinking, meaning that it's not, you could have one drink, put it down, no big deal. But opiates is why you're in treatment. It's like, I'm always encouraging patients. It's like alcohol being the universal adapter will ping that opiate pathway. And one of two things is either going to happen. Either you're going to like the buzz that you get from drinking, but know that there's a better buzz that you can get, and we'll go back to opiates, which happens a lot. Or if I'm lucky, I'll see you back in treatment now with alcoholism completely, to where now you become an alcoholic. You haven't touched opiates since you were last in treatment, but now you're in treatment now because of alcoholism. So cross addiction and transferring and all that stuff. So,
very well said. I mean, and bringing in Mark, when I worked with Mark, we had a patient in our detox unit that we treated, I would say at least 4 times, and maybe Mark can correct me in the chat, but every time we treated her on the detox unit, it was for a different substance. And the last one was indeed alcohol. I think she was drinking up to 4 bottles of wine a day. So it went from one to the other, and finally it was full-blown alcoholism.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, Kathy put in here, like the same thing with with marijuana, right? It's like, because it's legal in certain states, right? Or patients can get it at the gas stations. They can get the Delta 8, and now there's Delta 9, which is interesting. It's like, we could have a whole discussion on that. But a lot of times patients are, it's the same way. It's like, well, there's no problem with marijuana. It's like, right. But it generally, and thank goodness the people in the group that have had the experience before will say, yeah, I started back smoking weed, just smoking weed. And then the next thing you know, like I was back doing the same substances. And so, I mean, you can try to tell them and stuff and plant the seed and, for them, but it's really up to, they're going to have to make a decision, but
get sober, man.
Yeah. Leah also asked about like virtual support groups like Al-Anon for the family members of someone who struggles for alcohol. Bradford actually has on our website, you can see stuff about like our family, because we do like some family support. We also really are trying to get involved as much as we can with families, having them on releases so we can talk to them. But I'm generally always encouraging families to do Al-Anon and explaining that Al-Anon is basically, it's a 12-step meeting for loved ones for someone who loves an addict and alcoholic. What they don't realize about Al-Anon though is that Al-Anon, they get a sponsor, the family members, and Al-Anon, they work the 12 steps. They get to go through the process. So what's really amazing and beautiful in the process of that is that you've got let's say a husband who's in addiction, you've got a wife who's in Al-Anon. They're both working the 12 steps, and now they have this spiritual path they're trying to go down, and now they're working it together, and it's been amazing experience for them to do that. But yes, NAMI also has some good resources, and then Families Anonymous. Lots of great resources. And that's what's important too, is families feel alone because they keep it sheltered inside their house. They don't want people to know what's going on. And so they feel isolated. So it's great for them to have this access. And again, with Zoom, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin, but with Zoom, if somebody's embarrassed and like, I don't want to go to an Al-Anon meeting and somebody's going to see me and they're going to know, it's like, well, one, think about that. That means they're struggling too. So it's not something to be ashamed of. But I tell people, it's like, look, if you're afraid of seeing somebody that you know, then jump on Zoom because you can go to Al-Anon, right, or Families Anonymous. You can go to these places on these websites. Google these websites, and they'll tell you, right, and they'll, hey, join this link, jump into a meeting in Tennessee, and so you don't know anybody, so you can just get at least an experience of it. But let me swap it. There we go. So let me give Kevin. I'll mute out so Kevin can share some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of define what an emerging adult is, kind of what their characteristics are, what to look for, kind of how to understand them. We typically define emerging adults. We have here 18 to 25. I think we could open that up a little more, maybe 18 to possibly 30, kind of in line with what we all learned about Erickson's psychosocial stages, right? And we'll kind of dive into our next version of that here in a minute. But early adulthood, defined by Erickson, was like 19 to 29, right? It's intimacy versus isolation. You're trying to establish intimacy, relationships with others, kind of figuring out your way in the world and creating meaning within life, right? It's a distinct developmental period. Obviously, during this time, your brain is still developing. Um, you're learning a lot of new things. You may be, your education's going up. You're learning skills. You're learning trades. Some folks may choose to get married during this time. So a lot's happening during this developmental period. Some have children of their own at this point. So a lot's going on within this population. Uh, opportunity for increased autonomy. Absolutely. 18, 19, they may be breaking down the doors of getting out of high school, getting out of mom and dad's house. Maybe they want to go to college and live on campus in a dorm or in a like a Greek housing type thing. They're really looking for that autonomy. They don't want to be under the thumb of mom and dad. They don't want to, have to answer to anybody. They want to do their own thing, no more curfews, all this stuff. But with that comes a time of uncertainty. They don't really know how to deal with that sometimes, right? Maybe they're not mature enough to handle what university has to offer or what living on their own, the challenges that it presents, right? Because mom and dad have always taken care of that. They've, come home to a cooked meal after school or after practice or whatever. So they may not know how to, create their own meals. They're really kind of exploring things, right? They're getting involved in new things, whether it's at university or in their career, through volunteer opportunities, right? So they're doing all these things, trying to figure out how they fit into the puzzle of life, right? And for a lot of times, the emerging adult population that we deal with kind of fail at these things, right? They're out doing these things, they're experimenting, and there comes like a litany of perceived failures. Maybe they go to college, and after a semester or a year, they have to come back home because they partied a little too much, or they just couldn't handle being on their own. They couldn't handle the responsibility. Maybe they fell into the wrong crowd, with joining a fraternity or a sorority. All that comes with they exposed to different things. Whereas in high school they may have dabbled in weed or alcohol. Now they've moved on to harder things. Maybe cocaine has been introduced into their life, or opiate pills, things like that. So they're getting exposed to all these different things, and it's overwhelming. So the emerging adult, what we kind of define it as is kind of that. If you ever seen that old Matthew McConaughey movie, Failure to Launch, that's kind of what the emerging adult is. It's they've kind of gone out into the world, or maybe they haven't, and they weren't successful. So now they're back at home. They flunked out of college. They went to trade school. They may not have been successful in that. Some of them go to the military. And so they're exposed to a lot of different trauma, a lot of different drinking culture, which Linda said is encouraged, and that's correct. So they're now back home. They can't really hold down a job, so they're kind of stuck. right? Where they're supposed to be exploring themes of love, work, values, and intimacy, and all these things. That hasn't really worked out for them, and now they're really kind of in a rut, so to speak. And that's kind of when they come to our doorstep, in the throes of addiction now. They're kind of looking for direction. And I think that photo sums it up well. Which way am I going? Where do I want to go with life? And what does that look like for me? So that's the population that I kind of want to set up and define as what we're going to be talking about over the next half hour or so.
Yeah, it's again, it's the fork in the road, right? It's like, which way are we going to go? And, we'll even now with, 30, 40, 50-year-olds, right? They'll come to us and be like, I have no clue because their identity's been wrapped up in certain things, or they've been wearing masks for other people, afraid to kind of explore who they are. And, I think Deborah mentioned about like all these are also created increased exposure to new people, which is absolutely true, which is an absolute necessity, right? To have exposure to new people, people who think differently than us. But what's interesting though is that if you already have those social anxieties, now the new exposure to new people is only going to increase a lot of times that social anxiety. So again, that's why it's like so important if we can really hone in when it's like these young teenagers prior to getting into the emerging adult and developing these coping skills in a really healthy way. It's like by the time they get to that place, I'm not saying they're going to have everything figured out, but they're going to have some of that confidence in themselves to be able to start making some of these choices, to start like learning to fail, right? And one of our groups the other day, we were talking about failure, and nobody liked the word failure. So we looked up a synonym for failure, and one of them was missteps. So they called it a misstep. And it's like, so it's a lot of times people are so afraid to make a decision because they're afraid to fail. It's like, well, let's not look at it as failure. Let's look at it as a misstep. So now we take a step back and then we come back in a different direction. So if a lot of times people haven't had that experience, then they're afraid to make those decisions and kind of think for themselves. But I've got, let's see. Yeah, I guess it's not going to be able to do it. I'll end up. I'll send this to you guys, but for whatever reason I can't click. But it's like a little 30-second clip from 2008, I believe. And what it was it's like 30-second commercial, right? Where like the dealer standing outside of the gas station and no customers are showing up. He's like, business is slow. And what he said that, he said, so if y'all have problems with your kids and drugs, don't look at me. He said, because I got no customers. What he was saying was that a lot of times, like, especially the emerging adult population, was getting sometimes substances from their own household. A parent has an injury. They get surgery. They're a normal person. They take whatever 3 or 4 or 5, whatever pain pills to get through the first couple of days of surgery, and they have the rest of it sitting in the medicine cabinet. They forget all about it. The adolescent goes in there and grabs the medicine, or they have a stockpile of alcohol in the house, and the kid's able to navigate that. So it's like part of this is going to be the friends. It's going to be the environment, right? But it's also going to be even in their own household. So it's like parents, being on top of these things are going to be really important for that, to help, I guess, monitor some of these things. But we mentioned TikTok earlier and Snapchat. And so these are actually some of, on TikTok and Snapchat, some of y'all probably know this, some of y'all don't, but like there's drug dealers locally who deal on TikTok and Snapchat, and there's certain ones that you can find, and you send them the emoji that you're looking for, and then they will coordinate with you the money via Cash App, Venmo, whatever, and then they'll meet you to drop it off. So it's like even on social media, like they're not having to go find somebody. They can literally just on their phone, they're just scrolling up and down, and the kids know like what to look for. And if one knows, they'll tell others generally. And so they'll tell them like all these. It's really interesting that they don't have to go far to look. Because I think, yeah, Kevin, you and I were talking about like that's generally pretty prevalent these days. The emerging adult population knows about these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, you just think about with the rise of social media and everything, right at our disposal. Somebody earlier said instant gratification. I mean, you know, most of us, I would imagine, on this presentation, are of similar age. We didn't. I didn't have all this when I was in high school. I didn't, I didn't know about these things. I didn't, all I knew mainly was, weed and alcohol. I knew these other things existed, but it wasn't in my face all the time. It wasn't as prevalent, but it is now for the kids growing up, and they're getting exposed to it earlier and earlier. And I give a talk at local high schools pretty every so often, and uh, what I tell these parents is we can't shy away from the discussions that are needed to be had with the adolescent and the emerging adult, right? We can't shy away from hard discussions that need to be had. We can't engage in scare tactics, right? As Adam and I were preparing, I always bring up the DARE program, and how many of us remember DARE, right? The officers would come to school with the cool talking car, and they would scare tactic you, and drugs and alcohol are bad. They're gonna kill you. And you're like, oh, I don't want any part of that. And then, you sign your little waiver at the end of the presentation or however long. And, you get your cool shirt that is now populated in every thrift store across America, right? So you get your cool little shirt and you're like, I'm never going to do drugs or alcohol. And then, here you are 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And what are you doing? You're getting high, you're getting drunk. And you're like, wow, those DARE cops and my parents told me that drugs and alcohol were bad. And if I use, they're going to kill me. And well, they're liars because I just used alcohol and drugs, and not only did they didn't kill me, they made me feel pretty damn good. So what else are they lying to me about? And that's kind of kickstarts that exploration of, well, if weed and alcohol did this, what would this pill do? So I think when you have certain discussions, like for example, the birds and the bees with your child, I think the next discussion has to be cocaine and heroin, right? We have to educate our young ones about what is out there, right? And not scare them, but tell them truthfully. It's not an if you're going to get exposed to this, it's when, right? It's when. And that may be, like Adam said, in the home, in the parents' medicine cabinet. It more likely will probably be at school, right? In the
Yeah.
hallway. Somebody is going to introduce these things to our children, and we have to be mindful of that. So I think discussions need to be made early on or had early on, and not shy away from those, and allow the teenager or the emerging adult to ask questions and be prepared to answer them honestly and say, look, as a whole, these drugs or alcohol inherently aren't bad, right? They do a lot of good things, right? The opiates, for example, help people with true pain, right? If needed, right? But if misused, if abused, it could become an issue, right? So let's be mindful of that. Um, but I think it's so important, especially in this day and age when they're bombarded with so much on social media and it's so easily accessible. I think we have to have those discussions early, and we have to have them often, because a lot of the times we see these emerging adults when they get to college or they get to high school, and they get out on their own, they're kind of lost. They don't really know how to navigate the world, how to navigate their decision making. So they're caught in this trap of just poor decision making after another. And that kind of goes back to, well, I'm a failure. Kind of what Adam said at the beginning. I'm no good. I'm somehow less than. So that's feeding this beast within their own mind that, well, I tried these things and I must be a terrible person because I can't achieve these things. Whereas my peers, they're doing wonderful things. They're thriving. And why am I stuck? What's wrong with me? And so then you turn to the use of drugs and alcohol to make them feel better. and then they get caught in that trap and that cycle. And unfortunately, for a lot of them, that will morph into an eventual addiction. Some of them obviously can get out of that, with people intervening and saying, "Hey, may need to slow down," whatever that may look like. But a lot of them, going back to the whole choice in the matter, yeah, they chose to begin using these things, but they did not choose for it to morph into an active addiction. Nobody chooses that. So I think we got to be mindful of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, Dwayne's popped in some good quotes that like this one. The greatest travesty of Western civilization is that we stop teaching our children how to think and we start telling them what to think. And that's really true, right? And we're in a shift culturally where people are starting to think, and mentioned earlier about how, like, at least we, in those scenarios of the emerging adult, they get exposed to different people and different belief systems and things. So they challenge themselves, which is good. But what was it? I think it was like the Department of Census or whatever from the government was like had this thing. I was reading about it this week, but it talked about how 60% of the people live within 100 miles of where they grew up. And I'm sure that it's probably accurate for some folks here in the meeting, but meaning that like we generally kind of stay close to our areas and we don't really go outside of those areas a lot, meaning that we're not exposed to like different ways to see things and see the world. But it's pretty incredible when we look at patients, and like we're doing like our assessment with them and we ask about like, well, what was the norms like for you growing up at home about drugs and alcohol? Well, like, did your families talk to you? And I'd say probably 75 to 80% say like, my family never talked to me about it at all. It just was never discussed. Like it was almost assumed that you just don't do it, but it was never really discussed because it's an uncomfortable situation to talk about. So we don't want to have those conversations. And Kevin and I actually did, we've done a couple different ones, but with discussions with school counselors. And so we actually went and did this big talk with the school counselors a year or two ago. And what was interesting was that, like, interesting but not at the same time, so it was like surprising and not, is that a lot of the families, when this information was brought up to them about, hey, let's have maybe like an assembly about drugs and alcohol, a lot of the parents were way against it because they didn't think there's no possible way drugs could be here in Mountain Brook or in Vestavia or in Hoover or in Alabaster or wherever you're at. And it's like, oh, no, it's there. Whether you acknowledge it or not, right? You don't have to see something for it to be there. And it's there, And so we've tried to coordinate, a lot of times. And so again, a lot of times it's the family's pushback. So the schools kind of go, well, we don't want to upset the parents. So, okay, well, we'll just not. And it's a chance for us to at least maybe get in front of the students and have, an honest discussion like what Kevin was saying, where it's like, look, there are certain benefits to certain things. And there's people who can drink successfully, meaning without consequences. It doesn't affect their life. But here's what the pathway looks like that it could. And I wanted to touch on this. If you're looking for like an interesting clip to go look at on YouTube, you can type in Joe Rogan, Dr. Phil. I love some Dr. Phil, by the way. Just what a great voice, right? He's like, so here we're talking about this. I don't know. I just like his voice. But he had this great clip where he was talking about the data about the synthetic, fake synthesized prescription pills, which is where a lot of this stuff comes from, where a lot of these kids are getting it from. It's not from the doctor, right? It's being manufactured somewhere else. Generally, fentanyl is kind of synthesized in China, and then it's sent, as you can read down in the writing on the right, from China. It's sent to the Sinaloa cartel, and so then they create a lot of these pills. They actually did a bust back in 2022, I believe it was. And from one place that they pulled like 7 million pills. And of that amount of pills, right, 6 out of 10 had enough fentanyl laced in those prescription pills to contain a lethal dose of fentanyl. Mind you, that it wasn't fentanyl that they were looking at either. They were looking at the fake synthesized Adderall, sleeping pills. All of these things had enough fentanyl. 6 out of the 10 had enough fentanyl in it to create a lethal dose of fentanyl in it. So it's pretty incredible, right? A student is at school. They're like, man, I just need to study, but I can't go to the doctor to get Adderall or whatever it is. Well, they hear about it from a friend. Well, I get Adderall from such and such on, TikTok or whatever. They go and order it, and they may just order one to help them study. But that one could be enough that could be enough to be the one that takes them out. So it's pretty incredible when you think about it. So yeah, we mentioned about Arnett's 5 features of emerging adults, right? And so like there's again this identity of exploration, right? So young people are deciding who they are and what they want out of work, school, and love. That's kind of one of the stages that they're in, right? And again, what Dwayne with that quote said about how there's a lot of people who tell their kids, well, you're not going to school for that, you're going to go for this. Because this is what I've seen, I see this for you. You're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. We're not letting people kind of figure out what they want for themselves, or we're not asking them, having these discussions. So it's really good. They're at this age of instability because, again, the post-high school years are marked by repeated residence changes. As they're going off to college, they're going to, moving into an apartment, living with friends, moving in with a boyfriend, girlfriend. And then they don't really kind of get set in stone, established in a place until kind of in their 30s, early 30s. But they're in like the age of self-focus, right? So they're free to the parent and society. They're responsible for their job, right? They're responsible for going to work. They're responsible for doing their homework. They're responsible for what they eat. And so if they don't have a good kind of a routine in place, or a healthy routine, right? It's like, it's easy for them to get off track much more than maybe somebody else. It's the age of feeling in between, right? Meaning emerging adults say that they're taking responsibility for themselves, but they don't completely feel like an adult. Part of it is because they're still attached in some capacity to family. Sometimes it's because they've got people who will do things for them. My roommate in college, it was my best friend in college, but he would go home every weekend. And I'm like, why are you going home? We left. Like, let's get out. Let's not go. I think I went back probably 10 days total out of 4 years in college back home. Like, I was happy to be out and on my own. He went back every weekend because his mom did his laundry. And I was like, well, you can do laundry here. We have a washer and dryer. And he goes, yeah, my mom just does it great, and she just does it better. And so he's like, he was doing his thing, but yet he still wasn't. He still wasn't like completely in his own, spot. And then it's the age of possibilities, right? Optimism reigns. Most emerging adults believe that they have a good chance of living better than their parents did. Even if, they believe that they'll, their parents divorced, they still can believe that they can have a good, healthy life, a lifelong soulmate. So Kevin and I were talking about yesterday a little bit too, about this idea of like, the challenges, and we mentioned this earlier about the challenges in treatment with working with emerging adults and how it's different than working with other maybe populations. But Kevin, do you want to cover some of these, or?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I just want to be mindful of our time. It's 11:30. I want to leave a couple of minutes
Yeah.
for questions. So, really, when you are treating an emerging adult or a group of emerging adults, just be mindful of where they're at in the life stage of development, right? They're still in that exploration phase. So we have to kind of advocate for that and allow that, especially in the setting or the therapeutic setting, allow that to kind of unfold, allow them to discuss these things that may be taboo for them to discuss at home. They've never been allowed to discuss this with mom or dad or a mentor, a coach, or whoever it may be. So really kind of foster that safety for them to be able to open up and kind of explore feelings surrounding, their addiction and what that means for them, and really encouraging them to explore, childhood. What was it like for you growing up? Really challenging them to challenge mom or dad, because they may have this idealistic version of how they grew up, or they may not want to throw mom or dad under the bus, or grandma or grandpa, but in reality, they may have been horrible people. So allow them to even come to that decision of being like, yeah, now that I really explore and process, like, my dad was an alcoholic, or my mom was never around. And I've painted this rosy idealistic picture of what life was like, and that's just not reality. So, encouraging them to be open and honest, really highlighting the power of the group. If you're in a group setting, highlight the power. If one speaks up and shares a very vulnerable topic, and they see that they were not judged, or they were not, critiqued, or they weren't looked down on, or as a guy, I wasn't called a wuss or worse. I was allowed to share these things very openly and very raw. So you want to foster that vulnerability, and take away the negativity that vulnerability, the word itself, has, and really, allow that to happen organically. Keeping them motivated, um, is a lot harder at the beginning, but again, as you continue working with them, as you align yourself with them, they're going to feel more comfortable, and they're going to, motivate themselves. I always try and tell people, or other therapists, or whatever it may be, align yourself with the emerging adult, because a lot of times adults in their life have let them down. And so they're looking to push you away, right? They're looking for any opportunity to push you away. They're difficult, they're moody, right? And they're just looking to see if you're going to be the next person that abandons them or that walks away. So I think it's crucial that we allow them to understand that, hey, I'm not the punitive factor here. I'm not mom or dad. I'm not your CRO. I'm not the judge. You can say anything in this room and do most anything in this room, and I will not leave you. I will not judge you. And so I think we have to keep that in mind too, because they say some off the wall crap. And you got to be able to look at them and either call them out on it, or just allow them to talk about it. And if they see that you're not judging them and you're not going to leave, they're going to settle in, they're going to feel safe, and they're going to start opening up in a way that is more powerful than I've ever experienced. I think Adam referenced a group of mine that I had a few years back, and they created such a bond within that group room, to be in a circle with a group of men who felt safe enough to share and cry and really just put the work in, and you could see that healing. Because a lot of times as helpers, we don't really get to see the fruits of our labor, right? We're planting seeds, and we just hope that they do better after they discharge a treatment. But in that moment, you really got to see healing from the abuse of parents, healing from the abuse of coaches, and all these other people who, told them over and over again, you're not good enough. You'll never amount to anything. See, I told you you couldn't go to college. I told you you would do this. That's not you. That's not how you were defined. So allowing them to really explore that, um, getting the family involved if appropriate, right? If their family members are terrible, may not want to get them involved. But if they have good parental relationships, or good, uh, they foster good relationships around them, whether it's a sibling or what, get them involved. I think that's crucial. Um, really encouraging them to be honest about any cravings they have, anything that's going on. Again, you're creating that space that anything that you can say, just say it, because that's how you heal. And I think just going on my own experience, being, kind of a confused adolescent, and trying to find my way, navigate the emerging adult world, all at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was be heard, right? And I think that's what we have to foster within the rooms, is allow that individual to be heard. Because a lot of times when they share, I'm going through a breakup, or I'm going through this, we dismiss that. Oh, you poor child. You have no idea. Wait till you get to the real world of being an adult and pay a mortgage. But for them, that stuff is very real. That heartache and that pain and that sense of failure is very, very real. So I think we have to validate them at all times. And again, having them understand that I'm not looking away. I'm not going to walk away from you. Whatever you say, we're going to get through it together.
Yeah. No, it really is a good point. And for maybe those that like you're curious, like, so the KIA is not killed in action. It's know it all. So that's part of the denial part, right? Is that they know it all. They know it's like, oh, I know what you're talking about. And it's like, it's not like getting upset with them and be like, yeah, no, this is, you don't. It's like, allowing them to, again, meet them where they're at and be
Hmm.
like, well, maybe you do know. You probably do know more than me in this, this spot, But I think what helps them a lot is when we share some of our own experiences, right? Disclosure at times it can be extremely important, right? Like
Oh,
I'll
absolutely.
I'll yeah, right. I'll disclose like if I had an issue with my kid, right? It's like I'm gonna disclose like I'm telling them about like, hey man, this is what happened yesterday because it usually will tie into the meditation that we cover that day. And I'll say, yeah, I had this experience with my kid, yesterday, and I didn't handle it well, and so I was able to go back to him later and say, hey man, I was wrong. Let's talk about it. Like I want them to see, parents a lot of times, like even if they make a mistake, right? They refuse to kind of acknowledge it because I'm the parent, you're the emerging adult. Um, so if we're not willing to allow for us to acknowledge our own mistakes as human beings, as adults, right? Then they're not going to acknowledge theirs either because they're going to learn from that pattern. So it's really good for us if we make mistakes. It's like for us to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And
but like what Kevin, go ahead, Kevin.
yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Self-disclosure, specifically with this population, I think is crucial if it's
Yeah,
therapeutically relevant and valuable. Of course, right? We're not just self-disclosing to do it. If we
yeah,
think it has merit and value, it goes such a long way with this group. Because I think more so than any, this group see right through your BS. If you're in there just BSing, they're going to see it, they're going to see right through it, and they're going to shut down. But if they see you as a helper and as a genuine, transparent individual, right? Remove our therapist hat. We're walking in there just as a navigator for that group and for that individual. And if I can align myself with them through some therapeutic disclosure, I'm going to do that because they are going to it. They're really going to react in a positive manner to that to say, hey, like Adam said, I may be the therapist in the room, but guess what, man? I make a lot of mistakes. Guess what? I have troubles in my own, personal life. I'm huge on that. If you're coming in and you're not having a great day, be genuine and say, look, guys, hey, not really on it today. A lot of things are going on. I'm not going to get into it, but just wanted to let you know. If I seem a little off, it's because I am, right? Even as little as that, it
yeah,
goes a long way with this population. I think you have to be genuine and transparent. I had a professor in grad school. This has always stuck with me. Maybe I got a little bit of resentment, but she said that in your entire therapeutic career, you should only be able to count on one hand how many times you self-disclose. And I'm thinking that's a load of nonsense. What kind of
mm,
therapist are you? Don't be rigid, right? Have fun because that's what they're going to respond to. Because when you allow that to organically unfold,
yeah,
they are they are going to share in ways that you've never imagined.
yeah, absolutely. And that's the going back to that idea of motivation, right? And this next slide is like they may be here for external reasons, right? For relationships, jobs, whatever. It's like most of the time an emerging adult is in treatment because of an external scenario, some factor, right? They they want to stay on the team, or they're, mom and dad's going to send them off to boot camp or whatever it is, right? It's usually an external factor. But if you're good about creating and kind of fostering like a good therapeutic community with them, and again, you practice um, disclosure when it's necessary. It's amazing what happens when you can send, and I've seen this over and over and over and over again in the last 16 years working here. I've seen patients shift from what I refer to as the ceasefire, the external reason, court case, get family back, get trust back, whatever. I've seen them when they started to buy into this program because of their peers and because of their interactions with you as the therapist, that they shifted from a ceasefire to a surrender. And they went, well, hold on a second, like, maybe Kevin's right. Maybe I can come up with my own thing. Maybe I could start my own business. Maybe like I could go back to school. Maybe like, maybe I can change and like maybe it is okay for me to set boundaries. And all of a sudden, like they start applying these things and they get positive results. Now they're motivated. They're motivated because now they're understanding, like it says in here, they're understanding, they're understanding themselves, but they're also having empathy. Whereas before they were just like, oh, deal with it. What are you crying for? Those kind of things. It's like now they're like they put their arm around somebody. And one of my guys, I had an all male group the other day. My ladies were out for various reasons, but one of my guys was really struggling and probably I'd say late 40s, early 50s, really struggling and was like tearful. And the guy next to him put his arm around him and patted his back, And then after he got done sharing, somebody grabbed the tissue box and passed it down. That's what I'm talking about. Is like they understand that empathy, that it's not a horrible thing. It's not a bad thing. There's a great quote that I love. It's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. It's like it's better to be that strong, but then and know when to use it, right? Than to not be able to be strong and have no capacity to use it at all. So it's like you can be strong, but you can also be, you can also be that loving, empathetic. And it's positive reinforcement. The denial part, right? You'll hear those people say things like, I don't have a problem. My parents are the issue. My girlfriend, boyfriend nags too much. Jail and overdosing happens sometimes. No big deal. Kind of minimizing. The best way that handles the denial a lot of times is that there's confrontation. But the best part is it doesn't have to come from us. If we fostered a good group, right? That's an open group. A lot of times the group will confront the person in the first place. And I don't even have to do anything. I just sit back and they'll go, dude, do you really think that's true? You really think you can just go smoke weed and not go back to drinking and using? You really think blank, 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 whatever it is? You really think that's a good idea? And I'll just sit back and let them go. But because they have that respect with the peers, they'll go, well, I mean, maybe, I don't know. And it's all I need is a little bit of doubt put in there for them to like maybe start changing their mind. Some of them will have a denial that they have trauma. There's a great video on YouTube. It's Kevin Smith. You could type it in Kevin Smith People Magazine. And he talks about 30 minutes of going to this treatment center for trauma. And he's like, I had this trauma, but here was this trauma that I didn't think was that big of a deal, but now I realize it is. It's great. I think it's 30 minutes and, no cussing or anything in there, but it's really beneficial and powerful, especially with this population that like to see a male talk about some issues that normally wouldn't get talked about. Again, it opens the door. Cost analysis is really good. They're like, I don't really have a problem. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just figure it out math wise. How much money do you spend a week on your substance use? And they go, I don't know, $150. All right, well, let's look at how much that is a month. Okay, let's look at that. How much is it a year? Okay, how many years have you been using for? And then I'll go, here's your total. Now, what would you have done with that money if I gave you a check for that amount of money? And they're like, oh, dude, I didn't realize it was that much. It's like, yeah, because it's slowly over time. And then again, just getting them into the 12 and 12, which is one of the second book that AA came out with. But it's a really great book because it talks about how young people get sober before they had to lose everything, before they had to have consequences, before they went to jail, had felonies, all that stuff. So it's really important. And then just a couple of things about family. Families are trying to dangle the carrot, but it's the wrong mindset, because it's not, it's kind of like, again, the threatening piece of it. It's not helpful. They don't need to feel like interrogated, right? At times we need to be stern parents, but we need to learn that it's okay to actually have a conversation with our kids. My kid's 8, he'll be 9 in like 2 weeks. And he and I have like some pretty interesting conversations and deep conversations. So I'm able to explain to him things. I'm sure some of y'all got told when you were a kid, you asked to do something, your parents said no, and you said why? And they said, because I said so. That's as far as they gave you the information. I chose to do different with my kid. And I said, hey man, well, here's why I'm telling you no. And explaining it to him so he understands. He don't get to make the decision. I make the decision, but I'm explaining to him why I'm making the decision. But with family, like communication's key, right? We need to have family on board if we can, if they're healthy, like Kevin said. There's codependency pieces with it. Somebody actually said in the chat earlier about enablers. Enabling is doing for someone what they could and should be doing for themselves, right? So enabling is doing for someone what they could and should be doing for themselves. Helping is doing with someone what they can't do for themselves yet. So, give a quick example. Like we'll have people go, "Hey man, can you call and set me up an appointment?" We'll have people like I'll hear them talk to their parents. "Hey mom, hey dad, could you call and set me up an appointment for the doctor?" And I'll go, "Hey," I'll get their attention. I'll go, "Hey, hang up the phone, hang up the phone." And they'll hang up the phone and they'll go, "I'll call you back." And they'll go, why do I need to hang up the phone? I go, "You're 22 years old. You have a phone. You have Google. You can call and set up an appointment. I'll sit with you. Let's do it together." Right. But you don't need them to set this appointment up. Right. You've got to like take some, have some skin in the game and do that stuff. But a lot of times the parents will be like, "Yeah, I'll do it. It's just easier if I do it." It's like, no, they need to learn how to struggle and go through the hard things. But Al Anon, again, beneficial tool. Family counseling, really good. Boundaries. They need to know about boundaries, that boundaries are necessary. There's a great book called Boundaries by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend. I always encourage counselors to have it in their office to read it, but also for families because boundaries are necessary everywhere. It's so important. Length of stay. And again, this is just some of the stuff, but generally like, average length of stay, 21 to 28 days in treatment. But as you guys know, that's not a lot of time, right? And so most places, most countries offer 90 days of inpatient treatment. 21 to 28 days is a lot shorter. So we've got like a 5 to 7 day window of detoxing them through medications. But then the last 7 days, right, they're generally distracted because they're thinking about home, they're thinking about their significant other, they're thinking about friends. So that's a factor sometimes that we have to deal with keeping them focused on this. But there's also a really great TED talk by Johan Hari called "Everything You Know About Addiction Is Wrong," and he talks about like what Spain, or no, not Spain, excuse me, Portugal did with their drug policy and how it's so much different and better than any other place in the world and why it works. So if you get a chance, that's a great one to use in group, but also for yourself. Cravings, obviously, is something that we're going to deal with them because they're going to have a short stay in treatment. So they don't have that full defense mechanism yet in place. So that can be a really big factor for them experiencing cravings. They go back into the same environment, go back to the same like college, fraternity house, whatever, house with people are using, it's not going to be helpful, right? It's easy for them to have cravings and complications because, again, some things are socially accepted. So explaining to them, it's like it may be socially acceptable for alcohol, but do you think that you can drink without consequences? Let them come to their own conclusion with their own experience. But things that they can do to help with cravings is meditation, exercise, sponsors, meetings, things like that. MAT can be really helpful. Medicated assisted treatment can be really helpful. Vivitrol obviously is a really good one. And then, Vivitrol Sublocade can help with cravings and stuff. But just the last little thing is like, aftercare. We want to make sure that we follow up with them about stuff. Going to like a PHP program where they have more time to really kind of get their bearings underneath them. 12-step meetings so that they can focus on, getting a sponsor, getting, a healthy network, IOP, so they can deal with things in real time, have a group to process when they're out in the world with maybe not as much accountability. Therapy obviously is a good one. Sober living is great for them to have, again, a good support, learning how to live, and then helping them discover what their purpose is, because they're going to have a purpose in life. That's why they're here. That's why I believe patients are still here for this reason, for whatever reason, because they have a purpose. And so helping them discover that purpose, or at least get them in the right direction. So I guess we're going to open it up now for questions. Sorry I had to rush at the end, but for questions or anything else that you guys may have.
Thank you. I'll jump in here and help you all moderate some of these questions. If you have questions for our speakers, please put those in either the chat or the Q&A section of the screen. It's a separate at the bottom of your screen Q&A button, and you can put in a question there. A few things that have come through already that I noted I wanted to give you all an opportunity to speak to. First of all, fantastic job. Thank you for informing us all a lot of the great feedback we're seeing coming through the chat. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about the aspect of treating this population related to the early onset of initial use. We know that with these folks, in their early 20s, they likely started using when they were 12, 13, 14, sometimes even younger. What are some inherent treatment challenges when you're presented with a person with that use history?
Yeah. Ken, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges, and again, I'm specifically talking about a male population, and I'm sure this can translate also to the female, is having them identify and truly understand their pain and their trauma. Because a lot of them are just unwilling to even say that word. They'll come in all big and bad and be like, oh, I don't have any trauma. I don't have any of that, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, all right, I'm really good at my job. I'll figure it out. And one way you can do that is by like a timeline or a lifeline from birth until then, and just have them like a treasure map. We all did treasure maps as children. Have them like get on the floor, spread out, use crayons, markers, whatever, get creative and create this sort of treasure map or this timeline of using and notate really important things that happen in their life. And then kind of process with them during that activity and say, okay, I noticed that, here at the age of 15, you moved states. And because of that, it put a great strain on mom and dad, and they ended up divorcing, and dad moved back to the original state. And then right here, very close to that, you notated that that's when you first experimented with alcohol. So I'm wondering if there's a connection there. And then start piecing together those dots, and having them see, well, wow, yeah. Like I had one guy who just adamant, big burly guy. I know no trauma, no nothing. And at age 16, his grandmother died. He was really, really close to his grandmother. And at that time, he started taking pills to kind of numb out, and that led to alcohol and other things. And I said, I'm assuming the death of your grandmother had more of an impact than you originally gave it weight. And he was able to kind of see that and unlock it and have that aha moment of, wow, yeah, that I guess that is trauma. Like, yeah, maybe we redefine the word trauma.
I really like that intervention. I think that's something a lot of the clinicians who are joining us today can take some value in. Great suggestion. Another question that came up, we had a slide just in the last few moments about families. And we know at this phase of life, the family system may be taking on some different dynamics than when they were younger, and then compared to when they're going to be an older adult. Um, you gave great suggestions about resources for families, Families Anonymous, Al-Anon, things like that. What kind of specific feedback would you give to a parent of an emerging adult person, specifically related to what they can anticipate the person's treatment is going to look like, and how their EA young person is going to respond to that? What are some kind of tips or tricks that you might share with them to help them navigate early treatment and early recovery?
Yeah, I think just having, families involved. Generally, when an EA, emerging adult, is going to go into treatment, right, there's usually going to be some family interaction, especially on the front end. Now, when they get there, they can choose to, hey, I want family interaction or not. But usually on the front end, we can. And so we're usually trying, our access team is giving the family as much information as humanly possible. Hey, here's kind of what to expect in the treatment process. Hey, they're probably going to call you in 4 or 5 days and tell you that, like, hey, I'm not getting anything out of this or whatever. And it's like, that's a normal response. And so we're just trying to normalize that behavior, explaining to them, like, look, this isn't a fix, right? This is stage one. I always tell patients that, like, treatment is surgery, but after treatment is the physical therapy, and surgery is only good as the physical therapy you're willing to do afterwards. So letting the family know that, like, look, you're going to send your loved one here and we're going to do our absolute best to care for them, but also realize that, like, this is only step one. And that this is going to be a road that they're going to have to kind of navigate for the rest of their life. Here's how you can help. And the first thing we usually tell them, hey, Al-Anon, so that they can kind of get information like and start taking care of themselves. And in the process of them going to Al-Anon, what happens is that actually they're there thinking they're going to talk about their loved one, but in the process of Al-Anon and working the 12 steps, they actually get to identify their own trauma that they never dealt with. So I think that's one of the crucial things with us, how we navigate some of this stuff is like, especially if you've got a, let's say like a young child at this point right now, it's like, if we're not addressing our own past experiences and trauma, it's like we're going to project that onto them. So that's one of the ways that we can really help with this population is like having these discussions and talking about these things that we struggle with instead of hiding it and sheltering it and ignoring it. It's like, no, let's talk about it. And so when we do that and have that open line of communication, families generally are going to have a better understanding of what to expect, that like, oh, this is going to be a process. Oh, they are going to get better, right? But they're going to have to do this work daily. And here's, it's not just a fix to go to treatment and then get out and they're done and they're better. It's more than that. So that's a really good question.
Excellent. Well, thank you both again for a great presentation. Thanks to all of our attendees for your engagement throughout the session to keep this lively with your comments and your questions as we were proceeding through the session today. This will include today's session, and we have posted the evaluation link in the chat box a few times. I'm sure it'll pop back in there a couple more times before we hang up. It's also in the Q&A section. Please remember to be on the lookout for that post-session email. That's going to have the materials from today, so you'll have a copy of the presentation deck, a link to the recording of the session for today, as well as that survey link again, in case you don't grab it in the chat, so that you can do that survey today. Again, a reminder that we will have a 30-day period where the survey will be available to you. If you do not do the survey in 30 days, we will not be able to we will not be able to give you credit. Give us about 2 weeks once you've done your survey to get your continuing education certificate emailed to you. If after 2 weeks you don't find it in your spam folder, feel free to reach out. We will also be doing additional topics throughout the year. Please look to our website and social media for future announcements. Our next session of this type of meeting will be in June, and that will be on ethics. So we hope that you will join us then, and we'll give you a preview of that coming up. I hope you all enjoyed the session. We will see you again next time. Take care.